They left her in the snow to die like unwanted cargo, but the woman they tried to erase would become the one who destroyed them all. When Eliza Harper refused to marry the most dangerous man in the settlement, they stripped her of everything: her home, her dignity, her future. Cast into a frozen valley with nothing but the clothes on her back, she was meant to disappear without a trace. But fate had other plans. The cattleman who found her half dead in the drifts didn't know he was pulling a lit fuse from the snow, one that would ignite a war neither side could escape. Follow this story to the end, hit that like button, and comment your city so I can see how far this tale travels. The cold came first, not as sensation, but as absence. Eliza Harper couldn't feel her fingers anymore, couldn't feel the ground beneath her knees, couldn't feel anything except the dull weight of her own body refusing to move. The snow had stopped falling an hour ago, maybe two. Time had become as meaningless as the promises that had brought her here. She knelt in the center of the valley, a dark smudge against endless white, her breath coming in shallow clouds that dissipated before they could prove she was still alive. The wedding ring on her left hand, the only thing they'd let her keep, caught what little light the overcast sky offered. It was a cruel joke, that ring, a reminder of the man she'd loved and lost, now the only witness to how thoroughly the living had failed her. 3 miles back, the settlement of Covenant Ridge sat tucked against the mountains, smoke rising from its chimneys in neat, righteous columns. She could picture it perfectly. The church at the center, the general store, the rows of cabins where families gathered for supper, where children were taught their prayers and women learned to keep their mouths shut, where men like Thomas Gideon ruled with smiles that never reached their eyes and hands that reached everywhere else. Eliza had said no. That was her crime. That was why she was here. "You'll reconsider," Thomas had told her 3 days ago, standing in the cabin that had been hers and David's before fever took David and left her alone. "A widow needs protection. I'm offering you my name, my home, respect." She'd looked at his soft hands, his calculating eyes, the way he filled the doorway like he already owned everything inside. "I don't need your protection." "Everyone needs protection, Mrs. Harper." His voice had dropped to something quieter, more dangerous. "Especially women without husbands, without family, without options." She'd understood the threat. Understood it when his sister Margaret stopped speaking to her at the well. Understood it when the minister's wife turned her back at Sunday service. Understood it when the men who'd worked David's claims suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere, leaving her with land she couldn't work and a winter she couldn't survive. Thomas Gideon didn't make requests. He made inevitabilities. But Eliza had grown up in Philadelphia, daughter of a printer who'd taught her that words had power and silence was complicity. She'd learned to set type before she learned to sew, had read more books than most of the men in Covenant Ridge would see in their lifetimes. David had loved that about her spine, her stubbornness, the way she refused to make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. So when Thomas came back with the minister and half the town council, when they sat in her cabin and explained how a Christian woman had duties, how the community couldn't support those who refused to contribute properly, how her continued presence was becoming a disruption to the moral fabric of their society, she'd said no again. They'd given her until morning to reconsider. She'd barricaded the door instead. At dawn, they'd broken it down. Not with violence, nothing so honest. They'd simply removed it from its hinges while the minister read scripture about obedience and submission, while Thomas stood watching with that patient, terrible smile. They'd taken her belongings into safekeeping. They'd stripped the cabin of everything David had built, everything they'd shared, everything that proved she'd ever had a life worth living. And then they'd given her a choice that wasn't a choice at all. "Marry me," Thomas had said, "or leave." "I'll leave." She'd expected anger. Instead, he'd nodded like she'd confirmed something he'd already known. "Margaret will give you a coat. You can keep your ring. I'm not a cruel man. But you'll go now before you poison anyone else with your pride." They'd walked her to the edge of the settlement just after noon, a grim procession of righteous men and silent women. Margaret had provided the coat as promised, threadbare, 2 sizes too large, barely worth the name. No food, no supplies, no horse, just Eliza and the frozen road that led. Somewhere. Anywhere. Nowhere. "You'll be back before nightfall," Thomas had called after her. Humbled. Ready to accept God's plan for your life. She'd walked instead, Walked until the settlement disappeared behind the ridge, until the road became a suggestion beneath the snow, until her legs stopped obeying and she'd fallen to her knees in this valley, this vast white emptiness that cared nothing for pride or principles or the foolish woman who'd chosen death over dishonor. Now the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if they weren't so clearly a farewell. Eliza tried to stand and couldn't, tried to care and found that harder still. The cold had moved past pain into something almost peaceful, a numbness that whispered she could just sleep, just rest, just let go. David's ring caught the dying light again. "I'm sorry," she whispered to it, to him, to the memory of the man who'd promised her a life of adventure and partnership and had delivered on it right up until his body couldn't fight anymore. "I tried." The wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that didn't belong, rhythmic, purposeful, growing louder. Hoofbeats. Eliza's heart stuttered with something that might have been hope or might have been dread. Had they come back? Had Thomas decided even exile was too much mercy? She couldn't lift her head to look, could only kneel there as the hoofbeats came closer, as a shadow fell across her, as a voice cut through the wind. Christ Almighty. Not Thomas. The voice was different, rougher, deeper, carrying an authority that had nothing to do with scripture or social standing. Boots hit the ground beside her, and then hands, warm, careful hands, touched her shoulders. "Can you hear me?" Eliza managed a nod, managed to raise her eyes enough to see him, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a sheepskin coat that had actually been made for warmth rather than appearances. His face was weathered in the way of men who worked outdoors, creased at the eyes and mouth, framed by dark hair going gray at the temples. He looked like he was somewhere north of 40 and had earned every year. "Who did this to you?" The question was simple. The fury beneath it was not. "I did it to myself." Her voice came out cracked, barely recognizable. "Walked out. Wouldn't marry. Covenant Ridge?" He didn't wait for confirmation, just started unbuttoning his coat. "Thomas Gideon's work, I'd wager. That sanctimonious son of a—" He caught himself, wrapped the coat around her shoulders. It was still warm from his body, and Eliza nearly wept at the simple mercy of it. "Can you stand?" "No." "Can you ride if I lift you?" "Don't." "No." "We'll figure it out." He scooped her up like she weighed nothing, like she was something precious rather than refuse left for the crows. His horse, a massive bay gelding, stood waiting with the patience of an animal well-trained and well-treated. "Name's Blaine Mercer. I run the Triple Bar M, about 8 miles west. You're going to stay there tonight, possibly longer depending on whether your feet are frostbitten. We'll argue about it later if you've got the strength." He lifted her into the saddle, then swung up behind her, one arm circling her waist to keep her upright. Eliza tried to find words, gratitude, explanation, something, but exhaustion swallowed them whole. "Rest," Blaine said quietly, turning the horse west toward the darkening horizon. "You're safe now. That's all that matters." Eliza let her head fall back against his shoulder, let herself believe the lie, let the numbness finally claim her as the horse carried them away from the valley of her almost grave and toward whatever came next. The Triple Bar M appeared out of the darkness like a mirage made solid. A sprawling ranch house with golden light spilling from its windows, outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and permanence, corrals where horses moved like shadows against the snow. Eliza registered it all through a haze of exhaustion and returning pain as her body began to thaw. "Boss?" a voice called from the barn as they rode in. "That you?" "Get Emma," Blaine called back. "Tell her I need hot water, blankets, and whiskey. Now!" Boots ran, doors opened. Eliza felt herself being lifted down, carried up steps, brought into warmth and light that hurt after so much cold and dark. Voices swirled around her, concerned, efficient, kind. Found her in Mercy Valley. Feet look bad, might lose a toe. Covenant Ridge. I'd bet my best horse. Careful with that arm. Then a woman's voice, calm and commanding. "Out, all of you. Blaine, you too. Let me work." "Emma." "Out." Eliza felt gentle hands removing her boots, her stockings, examining the damage the cold had done. The woman, Emma, made small sounds of displeasure, but moved with the confidence of someone who'd treated worse. "You're lucky Blaine found you," Emma said, more to herself than Eliza. "Another hour and we'd be amputating. As it is, you'll keep your toes, but they'll hurt like hell for a week." She wrapped Eliza's feet in warm cloths, then moved to her hands. "I'm going to give you something for the pain. It'll make you sleep. Don't fight it." "Why?" Eliza managed. Emma paused, meeting her eyes. She was perhaps 50, gray-haired and handsome, with the kind of face that had forgotten how to suffer fools. "Why what, honey? Why help me? You don't know me." "Don't need to know you to know what Thomas Gideon is." Emma's mouth tightened into a grim line. "Covenant Ridge has been a cancer in this territory for 5 years. Blaine's been looking for a way to cut it out. Maybe you're it." She pressed a cup to Eliza's lips, something warm and bitter that tasted like herbs and hope. "Drink, sleep. Tomorrow we'll figure out what happens next." Eliza drank. The darkness came up soft this time, pulling her down into dreams where David smiled and Thomas Gideon burned and a stranger named Blaine Mercer rode through snow that never ended, searching for things that had been lost. 3 days blurred together in a haze of pain and healing. Eliza woke in a room she didn't recognize, small but comfortable, with a real mattress and quilts that smelled like cedar and sage. Her feet throbbed with every heartbeat. Her hands ached when she tried to move them, but she was alive. Warm, safe, for whatever that was worth. Emma came and went like a benevolent storm, bringing food and medicine and no-nonsense sympathy. "Eat," she'd command, setting down bowls of stew or plates of bread. "Your skin and bones. Can't heal if you don't eat." Eliza ate. Slowly at first, then with growing hunger as her body remembered what it meant to be fed. On the 4th day, she could stand. On the 5th, she could walk, though her feet screamed protest with every step. On the 6th, Emma declared her well enough for visitors and left the door open when she departed. Blaine appeared an hour later, knocking even though the door was ajar. "May I?" "It's your house. It's your room." He entered anyway, hat in hands, looking oddly uncomfortable for a man who'd pulled her from the snow without hesitation. "How are you feeling?" "Like I was left to freeze to death and live to regret it." A smile ghosted across his face, brief but genuine. "Emma says you're healing well. No permanent damage except to your pride, and I suspect that was already wounded." "You'd be right." Eliza gestured to the chair by the window. "Sit. I owe you my life. The least I can do is look at you while we talk." He sat, setting his hat on his knee. In daylight, in proximity, she could see him more clearly. Lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter as much as hard weather, calluses on his hands that meant he worked alongside his men rather than just directing them, a scar along his jaw that he hadn't bothered to hide. This was a man who'd built something real out here, something that lasted. "Tell me about Covenant Ridge," he said. So she did. Not everything. Some wounds were too fresh to expose, but enough. The settlement's founding 5 years ago, how Thomas Gideon had arrived with money and vision and slowly consolidated power, how disagreement became disloyalty, became danger, how women who resisted found themselves shunned, how men who questioned found their businesses failing, how the community that promised salvation delivered something closer to imprisonment. "David saw it before I did," Eliza said quietly. "He wanted us to leave, start over somewhere else. But he got sick before we could go, and then he was gone, and I thought, if I just kept my head down, worked the claim, minded my business." She laughed bitterly. "Turns out widows don't get to mind their business. Not when men like Thomas decide we're their business. He wanted to marry you. He wanted to own me. There's a difference." Blaine nodded slowly. "You refused." "I did. And they threw you out. They gave me a choice." Eliza met his eyes. "Leave or submit." "I chose to leave." "You chose to die rather than surrender." Blaine's voice carried something that might have been admiration or might have been anger. "That's not bravery, Mrs. Harper, that's suicide." "What would you have had me do?" The words came out sharper than intended. "Marry a man I despised? Let him into my bed, my life, my soul? Pretend gratitude while he erased everything David and I built together? She shook her head. I'd rather freeze. You nearly did. But I didn't. Eliza leaned forward, ignoring the protest from her healing feet. I'm here. I'm alive. And now I need to figure out what comes next. What do you want to come next? The question caught her off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked her what she wanted? David, maybe. Before that, her father. Not since. I want... She paused, searching for truth in the rubble of her old life. I want to not be someone's property. I want to work, earn my keep, stand on my own feet, literally and figuratively. I want Thomas Gideon to know I survived his mercy. She smiled without humor. Beyond that, I have no idea. Blaine was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those careful eyes. Finally, he said, I can offer you work. Room and board, small wage. Emma needs help in the kitchen. She's been doing it alone since our last cook left to get married. Nothing fancy, but it's honest labor, and it's yours if you want it. Why? Eliza asked. You don't know me. I could be everything Covenant Ridge said I was, proud, disobedient, a disruption to moral fabric. I've met Thomas Gideon. Blaine's voice went hard. 3 years ago, he tried to buy this ranch, offered good money, made it clear he intended to own everything between the mountains and the river. When I said no, he suggested I reconsider before accidents started happening. I told him where he could put his suggestions. He stood, placing his hat back on his head. A man who builds power on fear and silence isn't a man I trust to define morality. If Covenant Ridge cast you out, you're probably the most decent person to come from there in years. He moved toward the door, then paused. Take your time deciding. Emma will bring lunch. When you're ready, come find me and we'll discuss details. Mr. Mercer? Eliza called as he reached the threshold. Thank you for finding me, for bringing me here, for asking what I want. You survived, Mrs. Harper. Blaine's smile was small but real. That's not something to thank me for. That's all you. I just provided the horse. He left. Eliza sat in the quiet room, feeling something unfamiliar stirring beneath the exhaustion and pain. Not quite hope. She'd learned better than to trust that. But possibility, perhaps. The faint suggestion that surviving wasn't the same as living, and maybe, just maybe, she could learn to do both. Emma appeared at noon with a tray of food and a proposition. Blaine says he offered you work. He did. And I'd be a fool to refuse. Emma set the tray down with a satisfied thump. Good. I like you already. You're practical. The last girl we had couldn't boil water without burning it and cried every time one of the hands looked at her sideways. Lasted 3 weeks before she ran off with a cattle buyer. She poured coffee with the efficiency of long practice. I won't lie to you, it's hard work. Cooking for 20 men 3 times a day, plus keeping this house from falling apart, plus dealing with Blaine when he's in one of his moods. You'll earn every penny. I'm not afraid of hard work. Didn't think you were. Women who choose freezing over submission tend not to be. Emma handed her the coffee. But there's something you should know before you commit. Thomas Gideon doesn't let go easy. When he finds out you're here, he'll make trouble. Let him. Eliza sipped the coffee. Strong, bitter, perfect. He's already taken everything I had. What else can he do? Emma's expression turned grim. Plenty. He's got the settlement convinced he's their moral compass, got the territorial government convinced he's a pillar of civilization, got enough men on his payroll to make life difficult for anyone who crosses him. Blaine's been dancing around him for 3 years, trying to find leverage that'll stick. So far, Gideon stayed just inside the law. Barely, but enough. And you think harboring me will give him an excuse to step outside it. I think you're the first person to publicly refuse him and live to talk about it. Emma sat down across from Eliza, her weathered hands folded on the table. That makes you dangerous to him, makes you worth silencing. Then why risk it? Eliza asked. Why bring me here, offer me work, paint a target on your backs? Because someone has to. Emma's voice carried the weight of old conviction. This territory's got a choice coming. Become civilized for real, or become the kind of place where men like Gideon make the rules. Blaine believes in the first option. So do I. Sometimes belief requires risk. Eliza thought about David, about the risks he'd taken bringing her west, about the adventure he'd promised and delivered until his body betrayed him. Thought about the risk she'd taken refusing Thomas, the gamble that she'd rather die free than live chained. thought about this stranger who'd found her in the snow, and asked nothing in return except that she decide her own future. When do I start? Emma's smile was fierce and approving. Tomorrow, soon as your feet stop screaming. Today, you rest, heal, get your strength back. She stood, collecting the tray. One more thing. The hands know you're here, know roughly what happened. They're good men, but they'll be curious. You don't owe them your story, but they'll respect you more if you give them something honest, even if it's just mind your own business. I'll remember that. Good. Now eat. You're still too thin and I need you strong enough to knead bread without collapsing. Emma left. Eliza ate mechanically, her mind already moving ahead to tomorrow, to the work waiting, to the life she'd have to build from nothing for the second time in 2 years. It should have felt daunting. Instead, it felt like purpose. Outside her window, she could see men moving between buildings, ranch hands doing the endless work that kept a place like this running. She watched one of them pause to help another with a stubborn gait, watched the easy camaraderie of shared labor, watched a life that functioned on cooperation rather than control. This was what Covenant Ridge could have been, should have been, what it had promised before men like Thomas twisted it into something else. Eliza finished her coffee and stood, testing her feet. They hurt, but they held. That would have to be enough. The next morning, Emma woke her before dawn. Time to work. The kitchen was enormous, bigger than the entire cabin Eliza had shared with David, with a wood-fired stove that could have roasted an entire cow and counters scarred by years of use. Emma moved through it like a general commanding troops, showing Eliza where everything was kept, explaining the rhythm of meals, the preferences of particular hands, the way supplies were ordered and managed. Breakfast is at 5:30, Emma said, already mixing batter for biscuits. The hands come in 3 shifts. Early crew first, then the barn men, then whoever's been on night watch. Coffee needs to be strong enough to strip paint, and anyone who complains about the food can cook for himself next time. Eliza tied on an apron and got to work. Her hands were still tender, but they remembered the motions, cracking eggs, slicing bacon, stoking the fire to just the right temperature. It felt good to be useful again, to create something that would nourish rather than negotiate. The early crew arrived right on schedule. 6 men who stomped snow from their boots and removed their hats before entering. They froze when they saw Eliza, clearly not expecting a stranger in their kitchen. Morning, Emma said casually, not looking up from the stove. This is Mrs. Harper. She'll be helping with meals from now on. Anyone got a problem with that can take it up with Blaine. The men exchanged glances. Finally, one of them, grizzled, probably 60, with kind eyes, stepped forward. Ma'am, name's Charlie Maddox. Pleased to meet you. Mrs. Harper, Eliza replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Likewise. You're the one the boss found in Mercy Valley. It wasn't quite a question. I am. Charlie nodded slowly. Covenant Ridge's loss is our gain, then. Emma's been working herself ragged doing this alone. The other men murmured agreement, the tension breaking like a cleared weather front. They took their seats at the long table, and Eliza helped Emma serve, platters of biscuits and bacon, bowls of gravy, eggs fried in butter, coffee that could indeed strip paint. This is real good, ma'am, one of the younger hands said around a mouthful of biscuit. Best we've had in months. Don't insult Emma, Eliza said mildly. She taught me everything I know as of 20 minutes ago. That got a laugh. The conversation turned to work. Which pastures needed checking, where the fence line had gone down, whether the weather would hold another week. Eliza listened while she ate, learning the rhythm of this place, the concerns that drove it, the men who kept it running. She was collecting plates when Blaine appeared, looking like he'd already been up for hours. Morning. Boss, the men chorused. His eyes found Eliza. You're on your feet. Emma's orders. And how are those feet? Functional, painful, but functional. Good enough? He poured himself coffee, leaning against the counter with the ease of someone who knew he was welcome. Charlie, that fence in the north pasture already sent Jimmy and Tom out to fix it. The hay delivery? Should be here by noon. And the... Done, boss. Charlie grinned. We've been running this place a while now. You could take a day off and we'd probably survive. Probably's not good enough. But Blaine smiled as he said it, the affection clear. These weren't just employees. They were a crew that functioned like family, built on mutual respect rather than hierarchy. The men finished eating and filed out, each one nodding to Eliza on their way. When the last one had gone, Emma turned to her with approval in her eyes. "Well done. They're not easy to win over, but you managed." "I just served breakfast." "You served it without flinching when they stared, without apologizing for existing, without acting like you needed their permission to be here." Emma started washing dishes with brisk efficiency. "That matters more than you think." The day unfolded in a pattern of labor, cooking, cleaning, preparing for the next meal while still finishing the current one. Eliza's feet ached and her hands cramped, and by noon she was exhausted. But it was the exhaustion of purpose rather than despair. She was earning her place here, building value that had nothing to do with who she'd married or who wanted to marry her. Lunch brought a different crew, including several men she hadn't met. They introduced themselves with varying degrees of shyness and curiosity, ranch hands mostly, with a couple of wranglers and one man who handled the books and supply orders. All of them treated her with careful courtesy, like she was something fragile that might break if handled wrong. It was both touching and infuriating. "I'm not made of glass," she told one particularly hesitant young man who'd asked 3 times if she needed help carrying a pot that weighed maybe 5 pounds. "I survived being thrown out of a settlement and left to freeze. I can manage a stew pot." He'd flushed red but grinned. "Yes, ma'am." "Sorry, ma'am." By dinner, word had spread through the entire ranch. Eliza could feel it in the way the men looked at her, not with pity exactly, but with a kind of careful respect. She was the woman who'd said no to Thomas Gideon, the woman who'd chosen death over submission, the woman Blaine Mercer had pulled from the snow and given sanctuary. She wasn't sure she deserved the weight of that narrative, but she'd carry it if she had to. A week passed in the rhythm of meals and work. Eliza's feet healed, her hands toughened, her body remembered what it meant to sleep without fear. The ranch hands accepted her presence with easy camaraderie. Emma taught her the intricacies of feeding 20 hungry men on a budget, and Blaine appeared at odd hours looking for coffee and conversation. It was during one of these conversations, late evening, the kitchen finally quiet, that he asked the question she'd been dreading. "What do you want long term?" Eliza looked up from the bread dough she was kneading. "Meaning?" "Meaning you're welcome to stay as long as you want, but I doubt you want to cook for ranch hands forever." Blaine sat across from her, coffee cup in hand. "You've got education, skills. What would you do if you could do anything?" "I'd—" Eliza paused, hands stilling in the dough. What would she do? Before David, she'd worked in her father's print shop, setting type and running the press. After David, she'd been a frontier wife, learning to cook and clean and make a home in the wilderness. Now she was a widow, a cook, a woman starting over for the second time. "I'd want my own life," she said finally, "not defined by what men allow me to have, but by what I build myself." David understood that. He wanted partnership, not possession. She resumed kneading, working out frustration in the dough. "I don't know what that looks like yet, but I know it doesn't look like Covenant Ridge." "Fair enough." Blaine sipped his coffee. "For what it's worth, you're good at this. The men eat better now than they have in years, and Emma's actually smiling again. That's worth something." "It's worth my room and board and a small wage," Eliza said, "which I'm grateful for, but it's not a life." What would make it a life? The question was simple. The answer wasn't. "Safety," Eliza said finally. "Real safety, not just temporary shelter. The knowledge that men like Thomas Gideon can't reach me, can't hurt me, can't take away what I've built." She looked at Blaine directly. "Emma says he won't let this go, that he'll come looking for me eventually. Is she right?" Blaine's silence was answer enough. "He'll send someone," he said after a long moment. "Maybe to talk, maybe to threaten, maybe to drag you back. Depends on how angry he is, how much your refusal damaged his authority." He set down his coffee cup. "When he does, you'll have a choice to make. Hide and hope he gives up, or stand and fight. I don't have anything to fight with. You have the truth. You have witnesses who'll testify to what he did. You have me and this ranch and 20 men who've already decided you're worth protecting." Blaine's voice was quiet but firm. "That's not nothing. It's not enough either." Liza shaped the dough into loaves, her movements automatic. "Thomas has money, influence, the entire settlement believing he's righteous. What's my word against all that?" The truth doesn't need to be enough to win, Blaine said. It just needs to be loud enough to be heard. Eliza wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that justice existed, that truth mattered, that standing up to men like Thomas Gideon was anything other than suicide by another name. But she'd already tried standing up. It had gotten her left in the snow to die. "I'll think about it," she said, which was the most honesty she could offer. Blaine nodded and stood, collecting his cup. "That's all I ask. Think about it. And when he comes, because he will come, remember you're not alone this time." He left her with the bread and her thoughts, and the quiet certainty that the peace she'd found here was temporary, fragile, built on foundations that Thomas Gideon would do everything in his power to destroy. She finished the bread and put it to rise, then stepped outside into the cold night air. The ranch was dark, except for lights in the bunkhouse and a single lantern burning in the barn. Somewhere out there, beyond the safety of these fences, Covenant Ridge waited. Thomas waited. The reckoning she'd postponed but not escaped. Eliza looked up at the stars. The same stars that had watched her nearly die. The same stars that had witnessed every injustice and cruelty humans inflicted on each other with such casual certainty. "I'm not ready," she whispered to them, to David, to whatever forces governed fate and fairness. "I'm not strong enough yet." But she would be, had to be. Because Blaine was right. Thomas would come. And when he did, she needed to be something more than the woman he'd tried to erase. She needed to be the woman who erased him instead. The warning came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Eliza had started working in the kitchen. She was rolling out pie dough when Charlie burst through the door, snow dusting his shoulders, an urgency written across his weathered face. "Boss needs to see you, both of you, now." Emma didn't ask questions, just wiped her hands on her apron and headed for Blaine's office. Eliza followed, her stomach tightening with the kind of dread that came from experience. Nothing good ever required urgency and privacy in the same breath. Blaine stood by his desk, holding a piece of paper like it might combust. His jaw was set in a way Eliza had learned meant controlled fury, the kind that burned cold instead of hot. "What happened?" Emma asked. Blaine handed her the paper. "Ryder brought this an hour ago, from Covenant Ridge." Emma read it, her expression darkening with each line. When she finished, she passed it to Eliza without a word. The letter was written in precise, measured script that managed to convey threat through sheer politeness. It began with pleasantries about the weather and concern for neighborly relations. Then it sharpened. "It has come to our attention that a woman formerly of our community has taken refuge at your establishment, Mrs. Eliza Harper left Covenant Ridge of her own accord after declining a generous offer of marriage and protection. Her departure was voluntary, witnessed by members of our congregation, and undertaken with our blessing and a warm coat. However, recent reports suggest Mrs. Harper may be spreading falsehoods about the circumstances of her leaving, casting aspersions on the character of upstanding citizens and disrupting the peace we have worked so diligently to build in this territory. We trust this is mere misunderstanding rather than malicious intent. As neighbors and fellow stewards of civilization in these wild lands, we respectfully request the return of Mrs. Harper to Covenant Ridge, where she may clarify any confusion and reconcile with the community that nurtured her during her time of widowhood. We are prepared to welcome her back with Christian charity, provided she demonstrates appropriate contrition for the discord her departure has caused. Should this request go unheeded, we will be forced to pursue other remedies available under territorial law. We have every confidence, however, that a man of your standing will see the wisdom in cooperation over conflict. It was signed by Thomas Gideon and countersigned by the Covenant Ridge Town Council, making it official, making it a threat wrapped in the language of respectability. Christian charity, Eliza said, the words bitter as ash. That's what he's calling it now. He's clever, Blaine said. Notice he doesn't actually accuse you of anything specific, just suggests you might be causing problems, implies you're unstable, positions himself as the reasonable party trying to prevent discord. He took the letter back, folding it with deliberate precision. It's a play for witnesses. When this goes to court, and it will, he wants people to remember he tried the diplomatic approach first. Court? Eliza's voice came out sharper than intended. On what grounds? I left voluntarily. He said so himself in the letter. Doesn't matter what's true, Emma said grimly. Matters what he can make stick. He'll claim you're mentally unsound, that you need guardianship for your own protection. Or he'll say you stole something when you left. Jewelry, household goods, doesn't matter. Just needs an excuse to haul you in front of a judge. And judges in this territory tend to favor established settlers over wandering widows, Blaine added. Especially when the established settler has money for lawyers and witnesses willing to say whatever needs saying. Eliza sank into the chair by Blaine's desk, the weight of inevitability pressing down on her shoulders. She'd known this was coming, had felt it approaching like a storm building on the horizon. But knowing and experiencing were different animals. What are my options? Blaine exchanged a look with Emma, one of those silent conversations that came from years of partnership. Finally, he said, 3 as I see it. First, you can go back. Apologize, marry Thomas, live the life he's planned for you. No. Didn't think so, but had to offer it. Blaine continued. Second option, you can run. I'll give you money, a horse, supplies. You could make it to Denver or California or anywhere far enough that Thomas won't bother chasing. Eliza thought about that. Another flight. Another erasure. Another life started from nothing in a place where nobody knew her name or her story. Always looking over her shoulder, always waiting for the past to catch up. And the third option? You stay. You fight. You let me help you build a case that exposes what Covenant Ridge really is. Blaine leaned against his desk, arms crossed. It won't be easy. Thomas has spent 5 years building his reputation, establishing connections, making himself indispensable to territorial politics. But he's also been getting sloppy, overconfident. Men like that always do eventually. What kind of case? The truth. Emma's voice was firm. You're not the first person Thomas has pushed out, just the first one who survived long enough to talk about it. There are others. People who left, people who disappeared, people who had accidents after they crossed him. We start documenting, gathering testimony, building a pattern that even a friendly judge can't ignore. That could take months, Eliza said. What happens in the meantime? He's not going to wait patiently while we investigate. No, Blaine agreed. He's going to escalate. More letters probably. Maybe send men to talk to you. Try intimidation. Eventually he'll force a legal confrontation. Demand you appear before a magistrate, accuse you of something that requires official response. He met her eyes steadily. It will get worse before it gets better. That's a promise. Eliza looked at the letter again, at Thomas's careful script and calculated threats. Thought about the woman she'd been when she arrived here, half dead, defeated, ready to let the cold take her rather than fight anymore. Thought about the woman she'd become in 3 weeks of honest work and earned respect. I'm tired of running, she said quietly. Tired of letting men like Thomas decide my worth, my future, my life. David didn't bring me west so I could spend it being afraid. Then you'll stay? Emma asked. I'll stay. Eliza stood, handing the letter back to Blaine. And I'll fight, but I need to know what I'm fighting for. Is this about me or about something bigger? Blaine smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, it reached his eyes. Both. You deserve justice for what was done to you. But Covenant Ridge is a cancer that's been spreading for 5 years, poisoning this whole territory. If we can cut it out, we save more than just you. Then let's cut it out, Eliza said. Where do we start? With the truth, Blaine replied. All of it. Everything that happened, everyone who witnessed it, every detail Thomas thinks he buried. We document it, we corroborate it, and we make it impossible to ignore. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Starting now. Tell me everything, from the moment Thomas first approached you to the moment I found you in the snow. So Eliza told it. All of it, holding nothing back. Emma took notes while Blaine listened with the focused intensity of a man building a prosecution. When she finished, her throat was raw and her hands were shaking, but something had shifted. The story was no longer just hers to carry. It belonged to all of them now, a shared burden and a shared weapon. Good, Blaine said when she'd finished. That's a start. Now we need corroboration. People who saw what happened, who can testify to Thomas's threats and the council's complicity. They won't talk, Eliza said. Everyone in Covenant Ridge is too afraid of him. Everyone currently in Covenant Ridge, Emma corrected. But people leave. People run away in the night or get driven out or just decide they've had enough. We find those people. How? Carefully. Blaine stood, already moving into action mode. Charlie knows every settlement, trading post, and ranch within 100 miles. We start asking questions, quiet-like, looking for people who left Covenant Ridge in the last 5 years, finding out what they know, what they saw, whether they'd be willing to testify. That's dangerous, Eliza said. If Thomas finds out you're investigating him, he already knows we're not handing you over, Blaine interrupted. The investigation just makes our position formal. Besides, I've been wanting an excuse to go after him for 3 years. You've given me one. There was something in his voice that made Eliza look closer, search for the personal stake beneath the righteous anger. What did he do to you? Blaine was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, 5 years ago, I had a foreman, good man, hard worker, loyal as they come. He met a woman in Covenant Ridge, fell in love, wanted to marry her. She was willing, more than willing, but her father had debts to Thomas, and Thomas decided the daughter was payment. When she tried to leave with my foreman, there was an accident. Wagon wheel broke on a cliff road. She didn't survive. And your foreman? Left. Couldn't stay here with the memories. Last I heard, he was working cattle in Montana, drinking too much and living too little. Blaine's jaw tightened. Thomas called it a tragedy, sent flowers to the funeral, made all the right sympathetic noises. But the wheel had been tampered with. I couldn't prove it, but I knew. I'm sorry, Eliza said quietly. Don't be sorry. Be ready. Blaine's eyes were hard. Because Thomas Gideon has been getting away with this for too long, and you're the first real chance I've had to stop him. We do this right. We don't just save you. We save everyone who comes after. Emma cleared her throat. Then we'd better get started. Eliza, you keep working. Keep building relationships with the hands. Some of them might know people who left Covenant Ridge, might have contacts we can use. Blaine, you and Charlie start reaching out, quiet and careful. I'll handle communications. If anyone asks, we're investigating suppliers for a new business venture. Nobody needs to know what we're really looking for. And if Thomas escalates, Eliza asked. Then we escalate right back, Blaine said. This is my land, my ranch, my decision who stays here. Thomas wants a war, he'll get one. But it'll be fought with truth instead of guns. Eliza wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that truth was weapon enough against money and influence in 5 years of carefully constructed power. But she'd learned the hard way that the world didn't always reward virtue or punish villainy. Sometimes it just watched while the strong devoured the weak and called it natural order. Still, standing in Blaine's office with Emma's fierce loyalty and his quiet determination surrounding her, she felt something she hadn't felt since David died. The possibility that she wasn't alone in this fight. That maybe, just maybe, she'd found allies worth the risk. What do you need me to do? She asked. Blaine smiled. Keep cooking, keep healing, keep being exactly who you are. The woman who said no and survived. That's the story that'll break him in the end. They dispersed then, each to their assigned tasks, the ranch settling back into its usual rhythm. But underneath the normalcy, Eliza could feel the current of something building, a gathering storm that would either wash away Thomas Gideon's empire or drown them all trying. She went back to her pies with hands that only trembled slightly, determined to earn the trust these people had placed in her. The ranch hands would eat well tonight, would gather in the warm kitchen and share stories and laughter, would create the kind of community Covenant Ridge had promised but never delivered. And somewhere beyond the fences, Thomas Gideon was planning his next move, confident that a widow with nothing was no match for his carefully constructed kingdom. He was about to learn otherwise. The days that followed settled into a strange duality, surface calm concealing churning preparation. Eliza cooked and cleaned and learned the deeper rhythms of ranch life, while underneath, Blaine and Charlie reached out to their network of contacts across the territory. Emma maintained correspondence with trading posts and settlements, always with plausible business reasons, always listening for whispers about Covenant Ridge and its exiles. The ranch hands sensed something brewing but didn't press for details. These were men who'd learned that loyalty meant trusting the boss's judgment, meant standing ready without needing to know every detail of the plan. Eliza found herself grateful for their quiet competence, their steady presence that made the ranch feel like a fortress rather than just a collection of buildings. 2 weeks after the letter, Charlie returned from a supply run with news. He found Blaine in his barn, Eliza nearby mending tack because Emma had declared her hands steady enough for detail work now. Found someone, Charlie said without preamble. Family that left Covenant Ridge about 2 years ago, running a way station near Boulder Creek now. Wife says she'd be willing to talk, but only in person. Doesn't trust letters. What's her story? Blaine asked. Her husband questioned Thomas's bookkeeping on a community project. Next thing they knew, their business was failing, their friends stopped talking to them, their kids were getting bullied at school. They left before it got worse, but she remembers things. Says she's not the only one either, knows at least 3 other families who ran rather than fight. Blaine straightened, interest sharp in his eyes. That's a pattern. That's exactly what we need. It's a 4-day ride to Boulder Creek, Charlie pointed out, and if Thomas has people watching, they'll know the moment you leave. Then we make it look like normal business. Blaine turned to Eliza. How do you feel about a trip to town? We need supplies anyway, and nobody questions a rancher bringing his cook to help with purchasing. Eliza's hand stilled on the leather. You want me to come? I want you to meet these people, hear their stories, let them see you're real. You're not just a case I'm building. You're a person who survived what they survived. That matters. Thomas will know I left the ranch. Thomas already knows everything that happens here, Emma said, appearing from the tack room with her usual impeccable timing. He's got at least one spy in town, probably more. You hiding here just confirms you're afraid of him. You going about your business shows you're not. It made sense, the kind of aggressive common sense that characterized everything about this place. Still, the thought of leaving the ranch's safety made Eliza's stomach clench with old fear. What if he tries something? She asked quietly. Then he tries it in public, in front of witnesses, where it becomes official harassment instead of private dispute. Blaine's voice was firm. I know it's asking a lot, but we need those testimonies, and they need to see you're worth the risk of speaking up. Eliza thought about the woman who'd chosen to freeze rather than submit, about the courage that decision had required and the terror that had accompanied it. Thought about David, who'd always believed she was braver than she knew. When do we leave? Tomorrow morning, early. We'll make the supply run first, let people see us conducting normal business. Then we head to Boulder Creek, talk to these families, and come back before Thomas can organize a response. Blaine met her eyes with something that looked like respect. You don't have to do this. You can stay here, stay safe. But if you come, you need to be all in. No backing down if things get difficult. I'm all in, Eliza said. I have been since I decided to stay. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of brittle winter day where sound carried for miles and breath turned to ice in the air. Eliza dressed in layers, wool and leather, and a coat Emma had procured that actually fit, and met Blaine in front of the main house. He'd brought the wagon instead of horses, the bed loaded with empty crates for supplies and legitimate business papers that would hold up to scrutiny. Charlie would come too, riding escort and providing an extra pair of eyes. Ready? Blaine asked. Eliza climbed onto the wagon seat, settled herself against the cold. As I'll ever be. The ride to town took 3 hours, the wagon wheels crunching through snow while Charlie ranged ahead, checking the road and watching for trouble that didn't come. They passed other travelers, freight haulers, families heading to settlements, a circuit preacher with the look of a man who'd seen too much frontier and not enough salvation. Everyone waved or nodded, acknowledging fellow travelers in the vast emptiness. The town of Miller's Crossing sat at the intersection of 3 territories, a collection of sturdy buildings that served ranchers, miners, and settlers with equal efficiency. It wasn't large, maybe 200 permanent residents, but it was prosperous in the way of places that understood their value came from service rather than control. Blaine drove straight to the general store, helping Eliza down from the wagon with casual courtesy that nonetheless drew looks from the people on the street. A woman at a ranch was one thing. A woman accompanying the rancher to town was something else. It implied relationship, implied status, implied things that would get back to Thomas Gideon before sunset. Let them look, Blaine said quietly, noticing her tension. Let them wonder. Let Thomas hear that you're not hiding, not ashamed, not afraid to show your face in public. Inside the store, the proprietor, a sharp-eyed man named Henderson, greeted them with professional warmth. Mr. Mercer, what can I do for you today? Standard supplies, plus extra flour and sugar, and Mrs. Harper here needs some things. Henderson's gaze shifted to Eliza with interest. Mrs. Harper, I've heard about you. I'm sure you have, Eliza replied evenly. Most of it's probably even true. That got a surprised laugh. Fair enough. What do you need? She gave him a list, practical things, kitchen supplies, and personal items that established her as someone settling in rather than passing through. Henderson filled it without comment, but she could see him processing, cataloging, preparing to share this information with whoever asked. And someone would ask. Someone always did. They were loading the wagon when a voice cut through the morning air, polite as poison. Mr. Mercer. What a pleasant surprise. Thomas Gideon stood on the store's porch, dressed in town clothes that managed to look both expensive and modest. The uniform of a man who wanted you to know he could afford better, but chose humility. He was younger than Eliza remembered, mid-30s perhaps, with the kind of good looks that came from regular meals and minimal hard labor. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Gideon, Blaine replied, not stopping his work. Didn't expect to see you this far from Covenant Ridge. Business brings me everywhere these days. The settlement is growing, you know. Prosperity requires constant attention. Thomas's gaze shifted to Eliza, something cold moving behind his pleasant expression. Mrs. Harper, you're looking well. Much better than when last we parted. I had better company this time, Eliza said. I'm glad to hear it, though I confess, your continued absence from our community has caused concern. People worry when one of their own goes missing. I didn't go missing. I left. There's a difference. Is there? Thomas descended the steps with measured grace. From where I stand, a widow leaves her home without proper preparation, nearly dies of exposure, and ends up dependent on strangers. That sounds like someone who needed guidance and protection rather than independence. It sounds like someone who chose death over marrying you, Eliza replied. And here I am, not dead. Must be disappointing. Charlie shifted position slightly, hand resting casual-like on his belt near his knife. Blaine just kept loading supplies, but Eliza could see the tension in his shoulders. Thomas's smile never wavered. Strong words, Mrs. Harper, but words are cheap, aren't they? Actions matter more. And your actions, running away, spreading falsehoods about respected citizens, disrupting the peace, those have consequences. The only falsehood here is the idea that Covenant Ridge is a community, Eliza said. Communities don't cast out widows for refusing proposals. They don't threaten, manipulate, and control. They don't send women into the snow with thin coats and call it mercy. You were given a choice between submission and death. That's not a choice. That's tyranny dressed up in scripture. People were gathering now, drawn by the confrontation. Eliza could see them on the street corners, in doorways, pretending business while their ears strained for every word. This was exactly what Blaine had wanted, public witness to Thomas's threats, documentation of his character. Thomas seemed to realize it too. His expression shifted, became more measured. I can see you're upset, which is understandable. Grief does strange things to judgment. But surely you see the impropriety of your current situation, living unchaperoned with a man of Mr. Mercer's reputation? Mrs. Harper lives and works at my ranch, Blaine said, finally turning to face Thomas. She's employed as a cook, supervised by my housekeeper, and treated with the respect any woman of character deserves. There's nothing improper about honest work. Perhaps not. But appearances matter, Mr. Mercer. And the appearance of a widow living under your roof, dependent on your charity, accompanying you to town like a... Thomas paused delicately. Well, people talk. Then let them talk, Blaine replied. I've got nothing to hide, and neither does Mrs. Harper. You, on the other hand, seem mighty concerned with appearances. Makes a man wonder what you're hiding. The crowd had grown larger now, townspeople and travelers alike, watching the confrontation with the hungry interest people always showed when power structures collided. Eliza could feel their attention like weight, could imagine the stories they'd tell later about the widow who stood up to Thomas Gideon in the middle of Main Street. I hide nothing, Thomas said, his voice hardening slightly. My life is an open book, my actions beyond reproach. Can you say the same, Mrs. Harper? Can you honestly claim you've done nothing to be ashamed of? I can claim I've done nothing to be ashamed of, that you haven't done 100 times worse, Eliza shot back. How many people have you driven out of Covenant Ridge, Thomas? How many families have lost everything because they questioned your authority? How many women have you cornered with proposals that sounded like choices but came with threats? Careful, Thomas said quietly. Slander is a serious accusation. So is attempted murder, which is what you committed when you sent me into the winter with no supplies and no shelter. You wanted me dead. You just wanted it to look like an accident. I gave you a choice. You gave me an execution dressed up as free will. Eliza's voice rose despite her best efforts to stay calm. And now you're angry because I survived it, because I'm standing here proving that women don't need your protection or your approval to live. That scares you, doesn't it? The idea that maybe your control isn't as absolute as you thought. Thomas's mask slipped for just a moment, fury flashing across his face before he regained control. You're hysterical, grief-stricken, making wild accusations against upstanding citizens because you can't accept responsibility for your own poor choices. Then take me to court, Eliza challenged. If I'm lying, prove it. Let's get a judge involved, hear testimony, examine evidence. Let the whole territory see what Covenant Ridge really is. Perhaps I will, Thomas said softly. Perhaps it's time this matter was resolved officially. For your own good, of course. Of course, Blaine said dryly, because everything you do is for everyone's good but your own. We've heard that song before, Gideon. Thomas turned his attention to Blaine, sizing him up with eyes that had gone cold and calculating. You're making a mistake, Mercer. Involving yourself in this, giving her shelter, enabling her delusions. When this goes before a judge, your reputation will suffer alongside hers. My reputation can handle it, Blaine replied. Can yours? The two men stood facing each other, the space between them crackling with unspoken threat. Finally, Thomas smiled, a terrible smile that promised consequences. We'll see. Enjoy your supplies, Mr. Mercer. Mrs. Harper. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. I'm sure we'll speak again soon, under more official circumstances. He walked away, back straight, and steps measured, every inch the respectable citizen wronged by ungrateful inferiors. The crowd dispersed slowly, already whispering, already spreading the story of what they'd witnessed. Eliza released a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking, her heart racing, but underneath the fear was something else. A fierce satisfaction that she'd stood her ground, that she hadn't cowered or apologized or let Thomas rewrite history with his smooth lies. Well, Charlie said cheerfully, that went about as well as expected. Better, Blaine said. He threatened legal action in front of witnesses. That means he's planning to move soon, which means we need to move faster. He looked at Eliza with something like pride. You did good. Didn't back down. Didn't let him control the narrative. That took guts. It took anger, Eliza corrected. I'm so tired of men like him acting like women are problems to be managed instead of people to be respected. Then let's make him regret it, Blaine said. Boulder Creek's waiting. Let's go collect some truth. They finished loading the wagon and left Miller's Crossing behind, heading north toward Boulder Creek and the testimonies that might finally bring Thomas Gideon's empire crashing down. Behind them, the town buzzed with gossip and speculation, the story already growing in the telling. And in Covenant Ridge, Thomas Gideon sat in his study, writing letters to judges and lawyers and men with power, building a case that would force Eliza back under his control or destroy her trying. The war had begun in earnest, fought with words and witnesses and the slow, grinding machinery of territorial law. Neither side would back down now. Neither side could afford to. The question wasn't whether there would be a reckoning, but whether Eliza would survive it. Boulder Creek revealed itself gradually through the pines, a scatter of buildings clinging to a mountain valley where ice-cold water ran year-round and hardy souls carved living from stone and timber. The way station sat at the valley's mouth, a two-story structure built for function rather than beauty, with corrals out back and smoke rising steady from dual chimneys. A woman emerged as they pulled up, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 40, with the kind of lean strength that came from years of physical labor and the cautious eyes of someone who'd learned to expect trouble. Mr. Mercer, she called. I'm Sarah Donovan. Charlie sent word you were coming. Appreciate you seeing us, Mrs. Donovan. Blaine helped Eliza down from the wagon while Charlie moved to tend the horses. This is Mrs. Harper, the woman we mentioned. Sarah's gaze settled on Eliza with recognition that went beyond mere description. I know who you are. Whole territories buzzing about the widow who told Thomas Gideon where to stick his proposal. She gestured toward the station. Come inside. My husband's in town, but he knew what I'd be discussing, said to tell you whatever you need to know. The interior was warm and practical, with a large common room that served travelers and a kitchen where something savory bubbled on the stove. Sarah poured coffee without asking, then settled across the table from them with the air of someone preparing to excavate old graves. How much did Charlie tell you? Blaine asked. Enough to know you're building a case against Covenant Ridge and against Thomas specifically. Sarah wrapped her hands around her cup. I'll help however I can, but you need to understand something first. The people who left that place were scattered across 3 territories now. Most of us don't want to be found, don't want to remember, don't want Thomas knowing where we ended up. We'll protect your identity, Blaine promised. Any testimony you provide can be anonymous if necessary. Won't stay anonymous long. Thomas has eyes everywhere, friends in places you wouldn't expect. Sarah's mouth tightened. But I'll talk anyway because someone has to. Because I've got a daughter, and I'll be damned if she grows up in a world where men like Thomas Gideon get to do what they want without consequences. She took a breath, gathering herself, then began. We came to Covenant Ridge 6 years ago, right after Thomas arrived. He sold it beautifully, a community built on mutual support, where families could thrive and children could grow up safe. My husband John's a carpenter. Thomas needed builders, promised steady work, and fair pay. For the first year, it was everything he said it'd be. What changed? Eliza asked quietly. Thomas got comfortable, started making decisions without consulting the council he'd promised would govern together, started pressuring people to contribute more, labor, money, whatever he needed for his projects. John questioned the accounting on a new church building. Nothing aggressive, just asked to see the books. Make sure community funds were being spent like Thomas claimed. Sarah's expression darkened with memory. Next week, John's work dried up. Projects got canceled. People suddenly didn't need repairs anymore. Then our daughter started coming home from school crying because the other children called her father a troublemaker, said our family was disrupting community harmony. When I complained to the teacher, she suggested maybe if John was more cooperative, the children would be kinder. How long did this go on? Blaine was taking notes, his face grim. 3 months. 3 months of isolation and sabotage disguised as natural consequences. Thomas never confronted us directly. He's too smart for that. But his sister Margaret made it clear that cooperation would restore our standing. Cooperation meaning John stops asking questions and I start attending her prayer group where women learn their proper place. You refused, Eliza said, recognizing the pattern. We tried to endure it, thought maybe it would blow over. Maybe Thomas would move on to other targets. Then our daughter got sick, fever, couldn't keep food down. I sent for the doctor. He was suddenly unavailable, called away on emergency. Wouldn't come back for 3 days, he said, and maybe by then we'd have reconsidered our attitude toward community leadership. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. My daughter was 8 years old and burning up with fever, and they used her as leverage. That's when we knew we had to leave. How did you manage it? Eliza leaned forward, seeing her own near-death reflected in Sarah's story. Carefully, quietly. We sold everything we couldn't carry to a trader passing through, told people we were going to visit John's sick mother in Kansas, left in the middle of the night and didn't stop moving until we were 2 territories away. Sarah met Eliza's eyes directly. Thomas sent men looking for us. We heard about it from friends who stayed behind. He wanted to make an example, show what happened when people abandoned the community. But we'd covered our tracks well enough. Your daughter? Emma asked, appearing in the doorway with her usual silent timing. Healthy now, happy, free to be a child instead of a pawn in Thomas's power games. Sarah's smile was fierce. That's worth living in fear of being found. Blaine tapped his pencil against his notebook. You mentioned other families. Can you give us names, locations? Some. The Hendersons ended up in Wyoming, running a trading post. The Kowalskis went to California. They had family there. The Pratts I'm less sure about, but I heard they were somewhere in Colorado, maybe near Leadville. Sarah paused. But there are others you should know about. People who didn't leave. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. What do you mean? Blaine asked. I mean, Thomas doesn't just drive people out. Sometimes they disappear. Sarah's voice went quiet, heavy with knowledge she clearly wished she didn't possess. There was a young man, Peter Mathis. He was courting a girl whose father owed Thomas money. When Peter wouldn't back off, he went missing during a hunting trip. They found his body 2 weeks later at the bottom of a ravine. Hunting accident, the inquest said. But you don't think it was, Eliza said. I think Peter was an experienced hunter who'd lived in those mountains his whole life. I think he knew better than to get close to unstable edges. I think his rifle was found 50 feet from his body, which makes no sense if he fell. Sarah looked at each of them in turn. I think Thomas wanted him gone, and dead as gone as it gets. Can you prove any of this? Blaine's voice was careful, controlled. No, that's the genius of Thomas's system. Everything has plausible deniability. Accidents happen. People leave voluntarily. Business deals go bad through natural market forces. He never gets his hands dirty directly. Sarah stood, moving to the window. But when you've lived there, when you've seen the pattern, you know. You know the way he looks at problems. You know that people who cross him end up suffering just enough to make the point without leaving evidence. Eliza thought about the cold valley where Blaine had found her, about how easy it would have been to claim she'd wandered off and frozen through her own foolishness, how Thomas had planned it that way, her death as natural consequence rather than deliberate murder. There's something else, Sarah said, turning back to face them. Thomas keeps records. Detailed records of everything. Who owes what? Who's said what? Who's vulnerable to what kind of pressure? He's got a safe in his study where he keeps it all. John saw it once when he was doing repairs. Thomas made a joke about keeping the community's secrets secure. Those records would be evidence, Blaine said, leaning forward with sharp interest. Documentation of debts, manipulation, control. If you could get to them. But Thomas guards that safe like it's holding gold. Only he has the combination, and his house is never empty. He's got people living there, working there, always around. Sarah shook her head. You'd need an army to get in there. Or a good enough reason for him to let his guard down, Emma mused. They talked for another hour, Sarah providing names and details and fragments of testimony that began to form a damning picture. By the time they left Boulder Creek, Blaine's notebook was full, and Eliza's head was spinning with the scope of Thomas's corruption. It's worse than I thought, she said as they made camp that night, the stars brilliant overhead and Charlie keeping first watch. This isn't just about controlling a settlement. It's systematic abuse designed to look like community standards. Which is exactly why it's so hard to fight, Blaine replied, beating sticks to their small fire. Thomas has built something that protects itself. People who might speak up are too afraid of becoming targets. People who leave can't testify without revealing where they are. And territorial authorities see a prosperous settlement led by a respected citizen, so they don't look closer. So what do? We make them look closer. We gather enough testimonies that patterns emerge even skeptical judges can't ignore. We document everything, corroborate everything, build a case so solid that Thomas's reputation can't shield him anymore. Blaine met her eyes across the fire. And we prepare for him to fight back, because he will. Soon. He was right. The counterattack came 3 days after they returned to the ranch, delivered by a territorial marshal who rode up to the house with an official summons. Mrs. Eliza Harper? The marshal asked, dismounting with bureaucratic precision. That's me. Eliza's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice steady. I'm Marshal Crawford. I've been instructed to deliver this summons requiring your appearance before Judge Blackwell in 10 days' time. He handed her a folded document, his expression carefully neutral. You're being charged with theft of property from Covenant Ridge Settlement and abandonment of contractual obligations. Judge wants to hear testimony and make a determination. Blaine appeared from the barn, taking in the scene with one sharp glance. On whose complaint? Thomas Gideon, acting on behalf of the Covenant Ridge Community Council. Crawford's tone suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Look, I'm just serving papers. Whatever dispute you folks have, the judge will sort it out. What property am I supposed to have stolen? Eliza demanded, reading the summons with rising fury. Household goods, personal effects, items purchased with community funds during your residence there. Crawford shifted uncomfortably. It's all detailed in the complaint. 10 days, Mrs. Harper. If you don't appear, Judge Blackwell will issue a warrant. He left before they could respond, riding away like he was escaping something contagious. Eliza stared at the summons, rage and fear warring in her chest. "It's all lies," she said. "Everything I had, David and I bought ourselves. The community never gave us anything." "Doesn't matter if it's lies," Emma said, reading over her shoulder. "Matters that Thomas filed official charges. Now you have to defend yourself in court, which means lawyers, which means money, which means time." "Which is exactly what he wants," Blaine finished grimly. "He's tying us up in legal proceedings while he continues consolidating power. And if the judge rules against you, then I'll be arrested and dragged back to Covenant Ridge as a thief." Eliza's voice was hollow. "Where Thomas will generously offer to drop charges in exchange for my cooperation." "Not while I'm breathing," Blaine said. "We'll fight this. Get you a real lawyer, present the truth, make Thomas prove his accusations in open court." "That costs money." "I have money." "Why?" Eliza turned to face him directly. "Why are you doing this? Spending your money, risking your reputation, making yourself a target? I'm nobody to you, just a widow you pulled from the snow." Blaine was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Finally, he said, "You remind me that there are still people in this territory willing to fight for what's right, willing to say no when saying yes would be easier, willing to risk everything rather than compromise their souls." His voice softened. "My foreman's girl didn't get that choice. You did, and you made it, and damned if I'm going to let Thomas Gideon punish you for having courage." Something shifted in Eliza's chest, some piece of armor she'd been wearing since David died cracking, just enough to let light through. This wasn't pity, it wasn't even justice exactly. It was something deeper, recognition that her fight mattered, that her refusal to break had value beyond just her own survival. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing me as more than a problem to solve." "You've never been a problem," Blaine replied. "You've been a catalyst. Now let's use that." The next week passed in frantic preparation. Blaine hired a lawyer from Denver, a sharp woman named Catherine Wells who specialized in property disputes and had a reputation for shredding weak cases. She arrived at the ranch 4 days before the hearing, spent 6 hours interviewing Eliza, and emerged with fire in her eyes. "This is harassment disguised as litigation," Catherine declared, spreading papers across Blaine's desk. "Thomas Gideon has manufactured charges out of thin air, hoping you'll be too intimidated or too poor to mount a proper defense. We're going to make him regret it." "How?" Eliza asked. "By forcing him to prove everything. Every item he claims you stole, he has to demonstrate community ownership. Every obligation he claims you abandoned, he has to show valid contract. The burden of proof is on him, and I don't think he can meet it." Catherine's smile was sharp. "More importantly, every claim he makes opens him to cross-examination, which means I get to ask questions about how Covenant Ridge operates, about his authority, about what really happened when you refused his proposal." "He'll have witnesses," Emma pointed out. "People from the settlement who'll say whatever he tells them to say." "Probably. But witnesses can be impeached, especially when their stories are too convenient or too coordinated." Catherine looked at Eliza appraisingly. "How do you feel about testifying?" "Terrified," Eliza admitted, "but willing." "Good. Because your testimony is our best weapon. You tell the truth simply and directly. Don't let Thomas's lawyer rattle you, and make that judge see you as a real person instead of a legal abstraction." Catherine gathered her papers. "We've got 4 days to prepare. Let's make them count." They rehearsed obsessively, Catherine playing both friendly questioner and hostile cross-examiner, teaching Eliza how to answer without volunteering information, how to stay calm under pressure, how to turn attacks into opportunities. By the day before the hearing, Eliza could recite her story in her sleep, could anticipate objections and traps, could feel the rhythm of courtroom combat, even though she'd never set foot in one. "You're ready?" Catherine said on the final evening. "Trust yourself, trust the truth, and don't let Thomas make you doubt your own experience." That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. She stood at her window watching the ranch settle into darkness, the bunkhouse lights winking out one by one, the vast star field overhead indifferent to human struggles. Tomorrow she'd face Thomas in official proceedings, risk everything on the hope that truth mattered more than power. A knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Blaine stood in the hallway, looking as restless as she felt. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "Keep thinking about all the ways this could go wrong." Mind if I come in? We should probably leave the door open for propriety's sake. Eliza almost laughed at the concern for propriety given everything else. Come in. He sat in the chair by her window, leaving her the bed's edge, a respectful distance maintained. For a while they just sat in companionable silence, two people keeping vigil before battle. I've been thinking about David, Eliza said finally, about what he'd make of all this. He was the most gentle man I ever knew, hated conflict, preferred negotiation to confrontation, but he had lines he wouldn't cross, principles he wouldn't compromise. I think he'd approve of this fight, even though he'd hate the necessity of it. Tell me about him, Blaine said quietly. So she did. Told him about meeting David in Philadelphia, about his dreams of adventure and her father's printing press, about the journey west that had been glorious and terrible by turns, the way they'd learned to rely on each other completely, about the claim they'd worked together, the cabin they'd built with their own hands, the future they'd planned before fever stole it all away. He sounds like a good man, Blaine said when she finished. He was, which makes it worse somehow that he's gone and men like Thomas thrive. Where's the justice in that? There isn't any. Not natural justice, anyway. Just the kind we make ourselves, by standing up when we'd rather hide, by fighting when we'd rather flee. Blaine met her eyes in the dim light. David gave you partnership and courage. Thomas is about to learn that was a dangerous combination to create. I hope you're right. So do I. Blaine stood, moving toward the door. Get some rest if you can. Tomorrow we show Thomas Gideon what happens when he underestimates widows. The hearing was held in Miller's Crossing, in a room above the general store that served as courthouse when the circuit judge came through. Judge Blackwell was a weathered man of perhaps 60, with the kind of face that had seen every variety of human stupidity and remained singularly unimpressed by all of it. Thomas arrived with an entourage, his lawyer, 3 witnesses from Covenant Ridge, and enough supporters to fill half the spectator benches. He looked prosperous and righteous, every inch the upstanding citizen defending his community from ungrateful malice. Eliza sat at the defendant's table with Catherine, wearing her best dress and David's ring, determined to meet this with dignity and tact. Blaine sat directly behind her, his presence a solid reassurance. All rise, the bailiff intoned. The territorial court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Silas Blackwell presiding. Blackwell took his seat with the efficiency of a man who valued time over ceremony. Mr. Gideon, you've brought charges of theft and breach of contract against Mrs. Harper. Present your case. Thomas's lawyer, a smooth man named Preston, who looked like he'd never missed a meal, stood with practiced grace. Your Honor, this is a simple matter of property law, Mrs. Harper resided in Covenant Ridge for approximately 18 months, during which time she received various goods and services from the community. When she departed suddenly and without notice, she took items that were purchased with community funds and failed to fulfill obligations she'd undertaken as a settlement member. What specific items? Blackwell asked. Preston consulted his notes. A quilt valued at $12, a set of cooking implements valued at $8, various foodstuffs and dry goods valued at approximately $20, and a coat provided for her departure valued at $7. Total claim of $47 plus damages for breach of contract. Mrs. Harper, Blackwell said, turning to Eliza. How do you respond? Catherine stood smoothly. Your Honor, my client denies these charges entirely. The items in question were either purchased by Mrs. Harper and her late husband with their own funds, or were her personal property from before arriving in Covenant Ridge. As for breach of contract, no such contract exists. Mr. Preston, do you have documentation of community ownership? We have testimony from multiple witnesses, Your Honor. I asked for documentation. Receipts, purchase orders, inventory records showing these items were bought with community funds. Preston hesitated just slightly. The settlement's record-keeping is maintained by Mr. Gideon personally. Given the trust-based nature of our community, formal receipts weren't always— So you have no documentation, Blackwell interrupted. You're asking me to award damages based solely on witness testimony about who owned what in an informal settlement arrangement. The testimony is credible, Your Honor. Multiple upstanding citizens will get their turn to speak. Mrs. Wells, your response? Catherine stood. Your Honor, the burden of proof in a theft case rests with the accuser. Mr. Gideon must demonstrate that the property in question belonged to Covenant Ridge, that Mrs. Harper knowingly took it without permission, and that she intended to deprive the rightful owners permanently. He's done none of these things. He's simply listed items and assigned values without evidence. Furthermore, Catherine continued, warming to her argument, the circumstances of Mrs. Harper's departure are highly relevant. She wasn't fleeing with stolen goods. She was cast out with minimal possessions after refusing Mr. Gideon's marriage proposal. The coat he now claims cost $7 was threadbare and inadequate. The foodstuffs he mentions she wasn't given. This isn't theft, Your Honor. This is retaliation disguised as property dispute. That's a serious accusation, Blackwell said, his eyes sharpening with interest. It's the truth, Your Honor, and we're prepared to prove it through Mrs. Harper's testimony and cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses. Blackwell leaned back in his chair, studying both sides with the calculating gaze of a man trying to determine who was wasting his time. Very well, Mr. Preston, call your first witness. The next 2 hours unfolded in a painful dissection of lies and half-truths. Thomas's witnesses, Margaret Gideon, the settlement minister, and a shopkeeper, testified to seeing the disputed items in Eliza's possession, claimed they were community property, swore she'd left without permission or proper notice. Catherine tore them apart with surgical precision. Mrs. Gideon, you testified the quilt was made by community members for community use. Who specifically made it? Several of our women worked on it together. Can you name them? Well, I'd have to check. You can't name a single person who supposedly made this valuable quilt? And yet you're certain Mrs. Harper stole it. I know she had it when she left. Did you see her take it? Not exactly, but did anyone see her take it? Margaret's jaw tightened. She must have taken it. It's not in the community stores. Or perhaps, Catherine suggested mildly, it never was community property. Perhaps Mrs. Harper brought it from her previous life or made it herself, and your brother is simply claiming ownership of her possessions to punish her for refusing his proposal. Objection, Preston stood. Counsel is speculating. Sustained, Blackwell said. But I'll note that the witness has failed to establish clear ownership. Continue, Mrs. Wells. The pattern repeated with each witness. Confident assertions crumbling under basic questions, convenient certainties revealed as assumptions and spite. By the time Preston rested his case, the spectators were murmuring and Blackwell looked distinctly unimpressed. Mrs. Harper, the judge said, you may testify if you wish. Eliza stood, her legs steady despite the fear, and took the witness chair. Catherine walked her through the story, arriving in Covenant Ridge with David, building their life together, losing him to fever, Thomas's unwanted proposal, and escalating pressure, the final choice between submission and exile. Did you steal the items Mr. Gideon claims you stole? Catherine asked. No. The quilt was made by my mother in Philadelphia and brought west when David and I married. The cooking implements we bought in Denver before coming to the settlement. The coat Thomas's sister gave me was barely functional, and I would have refused it if I'd had any choice. Did you have a choice? No. I could marry Thomas or I could leave with nothing. Those were my options. And you chose to leave. I chose to live free or die trying. I nearly got the second one. Catherine paused, letting that sink in. Mrs. Harper, did anyone from Covenant Ridge offer you supplies for your departure? Food, warm clothing, transportation? No. Just the threadbare coat and pointed directions toward the road. In the middle of winter, with temperatures well below freezing. Yes. That sounds less like voluntary departure and more like attempted murder. Preston shot to his feet. Objection. Inflammatory and speculative. Withdrawn, Catherine said smoothly. No further questions, Your Honor. Preston approached for cross-examination with the cautious air of a man who knew the ground was less solid than it appeared. Mrs. Harper, you claim this quilt was made by your mother. Can you prove that? My mother's initials are embroidered in the corner. E.M. for Elizabeth Morris. My maiden name. Preston's confidence flickered. The cooking implements. Do you have receipts? No. Most frontier families don't keep receipts for basic household goods purchased years ago. Do you keep receipts for your cooking pots, Mr. Preston? That got a ripple of laughter from the spectators. Preston pressed on. You refused, mister. Gideon's proposal of marriage. Why? Because I didn't want to marry him. That's not much of a reason to turn down a respectable offer from a prosperous man. It's the only reason I need. My husband died. That doesn't make me property available to the next bidder. Mr. Gideon was offering protection, security. Mr. Gideon was offering control. There's a difference. Preston's expression hardened. So rather than accept a generous offer, you chose to abandon the community that had supported you, taking valuable items and spreading malicious lies about upstanding citizens. I chose to leave rather than be owned, Eliza replied evenly, and everything I've said about Covenant Ridge is true. Thomas Gideon runs that settlement like a tyrant, punishes anyone who questions him, and uses marriage proposals as tools of control. If that's malicious lies, then let him sue me for slander. Let's get everything out in open court. You're bitter because you couldn't have your way. I'm angry because I nearly died in the snow after refusing a proposal I had every right to refuse. If that makes me bitter, I'll wear it proudly. Preston had no response to that. He tried a few more angles, but Eliza had been well prepared, and the truth was a simpler story than Thomas's elaborate fabrications. Finally, he gave up and sat down. Anything further? Blackwell asked. The defense rests, Your Honor, Catherine said. Blackwell didn't even pretend to deliberate. I've heard enough. Mr. Gideon, your case is nonsense. Transparent retaliation against a woman who refused your marriage proposal. You've provided no credible evidence of theft, no documentation of ownership, and frankly, the circumstances of Mrs. Harper's departure suggest you're lucky I'm not charging you with attempted manslaughter. Thomas's face went white, then red. Your Honor, I'm not finished. The charges are dismissed with prejudice. Mrs. Harper owes you nothing. And if I hear you filed any further harassment suits against her, I'll sanction you personally. Blackwell's gaze swept the courtroom. This territory needs fewer petty tyrants pretending righteousness, and more people with the backbone to stand up to them. Mrs. Harper, you're free to go. Mr. Gideon, you're fortunate, that's all I'm saying. He banged his gavel. The courtroom erupted in noise, Thomas's supporters shouting protests, townspeople buzzing with scandal, reporters scribbling furiously. Eliza sat frozen, barely able to process that she'd won, that the truth had actually been enough. Catherine gripped her shoulder. Well done. You were perfect. Blaine appeared at her side, his smile fierce and proud. Let's get you out of here. They pushed through the crowd toward the door, but Thomas blocked their path. His mask had shattered completely, revealing the rage beneath. This isn't over, he said quietly, meant for Eliza's ears alone. You've embarrassed me in public, cost me respect, made me look weak. I'll make you regret that. Get out of her way, Blaine said, his voice carrying an edge Eliza had never heard before. Or what? You'll defend her honor? Protect the poor widow? Thomas smiled without humor. You've made an enemy today, Mercer. Both of you. I hope you're prepared for what that means. More prepared than you think, Blaine replied. Now move, or I'll move you. For a moment they stood locked in silent confrontation, the crowd watching with held breath. Finally, Thomas stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. Enjoy your victory, he said, while it lasts. They emerged into the afternoon light, the fresh air like a blessing after the courtroom's suffocating tension. Eliza felt shaky, drained, triumphant, and terrified in equal measure. He meant that threat, she said quietly. I know, Blaine replied. Which means we go home, gather the ranch hands, and prepare for whatever he's planning. Because he's right about one thing, this isn't over. Then what do? We finish what we started. We find those records Sarah mentioned, we gather every testimony we can, and we build a case that doesn't just defend you. It destroys him. Blaine's voice was grim but determined. Thomas wants a war. Let's give him one. They rode back to the ranch in silence, each lost in thoughts of the coming storm. Behind them, Thomas Gideon sat in the emptying courtroom, already planning his revenge. Ahead, the Triple Bar M waited, soon to become a fortress. The battle lines had been drawn. Neither side would retreat now. The first attack came 3 nights after the hearing, subtle enough to dismiss as accident if you didn't know better. Charlie found the broken fence line at dawn. 3 posts pulled clean out of the ground and 60 head of cattle wandering toward the open range. No storms had come through, no natural explanation for the damage. This was done deliberate, Charlie said, showing Blaine the post holes. See how clean the cuts are? Someone dug these out careful-like, made it look random, but knew exactly what they were doing. Blaine examined the evidence with grim recognition. How many did we lose? None, thank the stars. Jimmy spotted them before they scattered too far, but if he hadn't been riding early patrol, we'd be chasing strays for a week. Double the night watch, Blaine ordered. 2 men minimum, rotating positions. I want eyes on every approach to this ranch. The second incident came 4 days later. Contaminated water in the southern well, sickening 6 horses before anyone realized something was wrong. Emma found the source, a burlap sack stuffed with rotting meat that someone had dropped down the shaft. This is deliberate sabotage, she said, her face tight with fury as they hauled the festering sack into daylight. Someone came onto our land, past our guards, and poisoned our water. Eliza stood watching from the porch, her stomach churning with guilt. This is because of me. Thomas is targeting you to get to me. Thomas is targeting us because we stood up to him, Blaine corrected, walking over to her. This would have happened eventually, with or without you. You just gave him a reason to move faster. So what do? We can't fight shadows. We stop playing defense and go on offense. Blaine's voice carried the weight of decision made. Sarah told us about those records Thomas keeps. If we can get our hands on them, we'll have documented proof of everything, the debts he holds, the pressure he applies, the whole corrupt system laid bare. That safe is in his house, Emma reminded him. You said yourself it's never empty. How do you propose getting in there? We create an opportunity. Make Thomas come to us. Leave Covenant Ridge vulnerable. Blaine looked at Eliza directly. How do you feel about being bait? The plan was audacious and dangerous in equal measure. They would spread word through Charlie's network that Eliza had discovered evidence of Thomas's crimes, documents, testimony, something specific enough to be credible but vague enough to force his hand. The rumor would suggest she was planning to take this evidence to territorial authorities in Denver within the week. Thomas won't be able to let that stand, Blaine explained at the emergency meeting he'd called with his most trusted hands. He'll have to act fast, either to discredit the evidence or silence the source. Either way, he'll need to leave Covenant Ridge to deal with us directly. And while he's here, you'll be there, Charlie finished, understanding dawning. Breaking into his house, cracking that safe. Exactly. We'll need a small team, 3 men maximum, quiet and quick. In and out before anyone realizes we're not just passing through. Blaine looked around the table at the assembled faces. I won't order anyone to do this. It's theft, trespassing, probably 6 other crimes if we're caught. But it's also our best shot at ending this permanently. I'll go, Charlie said immediately. Know those mountains better than most, and I'm meaner than I look when it counts. I'm in, said a lean man named Douglas, one of the wranglers who'd been with the ranch since its founding. Lost a brother to men like Gideon. Be happy to return the favor. I can crack the safe, offered a quiet hand named Peterson, who rarely spoke but watched everything. Worked as a locksmith before I came west. Not proud of some things I learned, but they'll serve here. Blaine nodded, accepting their commitment with visible relief. That's settled then. Now we need to make sure Thomas takes the bait. They spent the next 2 days carefully seeding the rumor, letting it spread through the natural channels of gossip and speculation. Charlie mentioned it at the trading post. Emma let it slip to a traveling merchant. One of the younger hands got drunk in town and talked too loud about documents that would hang Thomas Gideon. The response came faster than expected. A rider arrived at the ranch on the 3rd evening carrying a letter sealed with Thomas's mark. Eliza opened it with hands that only trembled slightly. The message was brief and coldly polite. Thomas requested a meeting at the ranch to discuss the false rumors being spread about him, to settle this matter privately before it escalated into something regrettable. He would arrive in 2 days with several members of the Covenant Ridge Council to hear whatever accusations she wished to make and provide satisfactory refutation. He's coming himself, Eliza said, passing the letter to Blaine. That's good, right? Means he's worried? Means he's planning something, Blaine corrected. Thomas doesn't travel for simple conversations. He's either coming to intimidate you into silence or to do something more permanent. He looked at Charlie. How many men will he bring? Letter says council members, which probably means 5 or 6, but he'll have guards too, maybe another 10. Charlie whistled low. That's a small army for a peaceful discussion. Then we'll be ready for them. Blaine turned to his assembled crew. When Thomas arrives, I want every hand visible and armed. Nothing threatening, just working around the ranch like normal, except everyone happens to have a rifle nearby. Make it clear that any violence will be met with overwhelming response. And while he's here making threats, Douglas added with a grim smile, we'll be in Covenant Ridge, making withdrawals. The next day was spent in tense preparation. Blaine worked with Eliza on exactly what to say when Thomas arrived, how to keep him engaged without giving away the real plan. Emma organized the kitchen to feed potential guests, maintaining the fiction of hospitality while preparing for siege. The ranch hands checked weapons, positioned themselves strategically, transformed the Triple Bar M into a fortress disguised as a working ranch. Eliza found herself in the quiet afternoon hours cleaning her room with obsessive focus, needing something physical to do with her nervous energy. She was making her bed when Blaine knocked on the open door. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Plenty of them. Too many, actually. I keep thinking about everything that could go wrong." He entered, settling into the chair that had become his usual spot during their late-night conversations. That's normal before any battle. The trick is not letting the worry paralyze you. "Did you fight in the war?" Eliza asked, realizing she knew very little about his past. "Colorado Volunteers, last 2 years of it. Saw enough combat to know I never wanted to see more." His expression went distant with memory. War teaches you things about yourself, what you're capable of, what you're willing to sacrifice, how thin the line is between civilization and chaos. I came west afterward because I needed space, needed to build something instead of destroying things. And now you're planning a raid that could destroy everything you've built. "I'm planning to stop a man who's been destroying lives for 5 years. Blaine met her eyes steadily. "There's a difference. Sometimes destruction is necessary to make space for something better." Eliza sat on the edge of her bed, choosing words carefully. "If this goes wrong, if Thomas catches your men, or if the territorial authorities decide breaking into his house is worse than what he's done, you could lose everything. The ranch, your reputation, possibly your freedom. All for a widow you barely know." "I know you well enough," Blaine said quietly. "Know you've got more courage in your smallest finger than Thomas has in his whole body. Know you represent everything I hope this territory could be. People building lives based on merit and character instead of manipulation and control. Know that letting him win means accepting that power always trumps principle." He paused. "And I know that's not acceptable to me." Something in his voice made Eliza look closer, see past the practical rancher to the man underneath. "This isn't just about justice, is it?" "No," Blaine admitted. "It's about redemption. I couldn't save my foreman's girl. Couldn't prove what Thomas did, couldn't stop him, couldn't do anything except watch a good woman get buried and a good man break under grief. But I can save you. Can stop Thomas now before he destroys anyone else. Maybe that doesn't erase what I failed to do before, but it's better than doing nothing." "You didn't fail," Eliza said firmly. "You didn't have evidence, didn't have cause, didn't have the tools to fight him. That's not failure. That's being outmaneuvered by someone more ruthless. Doesn't make the outcome any different. No. But it means this time, when we win, you're not just protecting me. You're finishing what you started 3 years ago." She stood, moved to stand in front of him. "Thank you for that. For seeing this as more than charity or obligation. For trusting that I'm worth the fight." Blaine stood as well, and for a moment they were close enough that Eliza could see the flecks of gray in his dark eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his presence. "You've always been worth the fight, Eliza. You just needed someone to stand beside you long enough to prove it." The moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities and the awareness that tomorrow might change everything. Then Blaine stepped back, restoring proper distance, and the spell broke. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be long, and I need you sharp." He left. Eliza sat back on her bed, touching her lips like she could still feel the words he'd spoken, the intensity of his belief in her worth. David had loved her, had believed in her, had given her partnership and respect, but David was gone. His love a beautiful memory that couldn't warm her in the present. Blaine was here, real and solid and fighting battles in her name without asking for anything in return except that she keep being herself. She didn't know what that meant yet, what it could mean when the fighting was done, but she felt something shifting in her chest, some frozen piece of grief beginning to thaw. Tomorrow Thomas would come. Tomorrow, the final confrontation would begin. Tonight, she let herself imagine what might come after, if they survived. Dawn broke cold and clear, the kind of crystalline morning that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Thomas arrived at midday with exactly the force Charlie had predicted. 6 council members in a carriage, 12 armed riders as escort, all of them dressed in their finest as if attending a social call rather than a confrontation. Eliza watched from the porch as they rode up, flanked by Blaine on one side and Emma on the other. The ranch hands were positioned throughout the yard, visible but not obviously threatening, each man armed and ready. Thomas dismounted with practiced grace, his smile as cold as the air. "Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Harper, thank you for receiving us." "You demanded a meeting," Blaine replied. "We're accommodating it, nothing more." "Of course." Thomas gestured to his companions. "You know the council members, Reverend Morrison, Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Fletcher, and others, all concerned citizens who've come to hear these alleged accusations and provide proper context." "Context," Eliza repeated. "Is that what you're calling your lies now?" "I'm calling them the truth, Mrs. Harper, something you seem to have difficulty distinguishing lately." Thomas approached the porch with calculated confidence. "You've been spreading rumors about Covenant Ridge, about me specifically, claiming persecution, claiming attempted murder, claiming all manner of dramatic persecution. It's causing problems, frightening potential settlers, damaging reputations, disrupting the peace we've worked so hard to build. Everything I've said is true. Then prove it. Show me this evidence you claim to have. Present your witnesses, your documentation, whatever justifies these wild accusations." Thomas spread his hands in a gesture of openness that fooled exactly no one. "I'm here to give you that opportunity. Make your case, publicly and officially. If you can substantiate even a fraction of your claims, I'll submit to any judgment you demand." It was a beautiful trap, demanding proof she didn't have, knowing she couldn't produce it, positioning himself as the reasonable party while painting her as an hysteric. The council members watched with expressions ranging from sympathy to skepticism, already prepared to dismiss whatever she said. "The evidence is being compiled," Blaine said before Eliza could respond. "Testimonies from people you drove out of Covenant Ridge, documentation of your manipulation and control, proof of crimes you thought you'd buried. It'll be presented to territorial authorities in Denver next week." "How convenient. Evidence that exists somewhere else that I can't examine, that will be presented to distant authorities rather than local ones." Thomas's smile sharpened. Forgive me if I'm skeptical. Your skepticism doesn't change the truth." "No, but it does make me wonder what you're really after here, Mercer. You've taken in a woman who refused to accept her proper place. You've encouraged her delusions of persecution. You've threatened legal action based on evidence you won't produce. One might think you have ulterior motives." "The only ulterior motive here is stopping you from hurting anyone else," Eliza said, her voice ringing across the yard. "You tried to kill me, Thomas. You cast me out in winter with nothing and expected me to die quietly. When I survived, you tried to destroy me legally. When that failed, you started attacking this ranch, poisoning wells and breaking fences and terrorizing good people, all because I said no to your proposal." "You're delusional," Thomas replied, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition that she wasn't backing down, wasn't afraid, wasn't playing the victim he expected. "Am I? Then let's examine your safe, Thomas. The one in your study where you keep records of everyone you control. Let's review those debts you hold, those favors you've called in, those accidents you've arranged. Let's make all of that public and see who the territory believes." Thomas went very still. "You're threatening to break into my home. I'm threatening to expose what you've done. How we get the evidence is less important than what it proves." For a moment, genuine fury broke through Thomas's controlled facade. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. Covenant Ridge provides order in chaos, stability in wilderness. People need guidance, need structure, need someone strong enough to make difficult decisions. I've built something vital here, and I won't let a bitter widow destroy it out of spite." "You've built a kingdom based on fear," Eliza countered. "And kingdoms fall, Thomas. Usually when people stop being afraid." The council members were shifting uncomfortably now, clearly not expecting this level of confrontation. Several of Thomas's guards had their hands on their weapons, tension ratcheting up with every exchange. "Enough!" Reverend Morrison said, stepping forward with the authority of his position. "This is accomplishing nothing except escalating tempers. Mrs. Harper, if you have genuine grievances, they should be addressed through proper channels. Mr. Gideon, if you believe you've been slandered, you have legal recourse. But this," he gestured at the armed standoff developing in the ranch yard, "this helps no one." "I agree," Blaine said, "which is why I'm giving Thomas a choice. Leave Mrs. Harper alone, stop the sabotage against my ranch, and we'll compile our evidence properly for territorial review. Or continue this war, and we'll make sure every newspaper between here and Denver knows exactly what Covenant Ridge really is." Oh, Thomas studied Blaine with calculating intensity, clearly weighing options and outcomes. Finally, he said, "I'll need to consult with the council. May we use your parlor for a private discussion?" It was exactly what they needed. Thomas and his inner circle distracted inside, his guards waiting outside, attention focused here while 3 men rode toward Covenant Ridge to rob his secrets. "Of course," Blaine said, gesturing toward the house. "Emma will show you in." Thomas and 6 council members filed inside, leaving their guards in the yard under the watchful eyes of Blaine's men. The standoff continued, tension thick enough to cut, everyone waiting for something to break. Inside the parlor, Thomas paced while his council members took seats. Through the thin walls, Eliza could hear the murmur of argument, Morrison's voice urging caution, Thomas's sharp responses cutting through attempts at moderation. "This is taking too long," Charlie muttered, appearing at Blaine's elbow. "The boys should be at Covenant Ridge by now, but every minute Thomas is here is a minute they could get caught." "They'll make it," Blaine said with more confidence than he probably felt. "Douglas knows those trails. Peterson can crack any safe, and they've got Charlie's maps. Trust them." "Trusting them ain't the problem. It's trusting that Thomas doesn't have a contingency plan we haven't thought of." As if summoned by the words, one of Thomas's guards suddenly stiffened, hand going to his ear like he was listening to something. He turned to his companions, spoke urgently, and 3 of them immediately mounted their horses. "They're leaving," Eliza said, alarm spiking through her. "Why are they leaving?" The guard approached Blaine with barely concealed hostility. "Mr. Gideon has business that requires our attention elsewhere. We'll return shortly." "What business?" "Nothing that concerns you." The guards rode out at a gallop, heading east toward Covenant Ridge. "They know," Charlie breathed. "Somehow, Thomas knows." Blaine's expression turned grim. "Get inside. Warn Thomas that if anything happens to my men, this ends badly for everyone." But before Charlie could move, the parlor door opened and Thomas emerged, his smile victorious. "I believe our discussion is concluded. The council and I have decided that Mrs. Harper's accusations are baseless, and her presence in this territory is disruptive. We'll be recommending to territorial authorities that she be removed for her own safety and the peace of the region." "You can recommend whatever you want," Eliza said. "Doesn't make it legal. Legal is whatever the authorities decide it is, and I have considerably more influence with those authorities than you do." Thomas pulled on his gloves with deliberate precision. "I gave you a chance to marry well, Mrs. Harper. Then I gave you a chance to leave quietly. Then I gave you a chance to admit your false accusations. You've refused every opportunity for mercy. Now you'll face the consequences of your obstinacy." "The only consequences here will be yours," Blaine said. "When the truth comes out—" "What truth? The ravings of a grief-addled widow and the testimony of people who abandoned their community? You have nothing, Mercer. You've always had nothing. And the 3 men you sent to rob my home will find that out very soon." The words hit like physical blows. Thomas had known from the beginning, had let them plan and execute their raid while he sat here providing alibi and witnesses to his own innocence. "You're bluffing," Eliza said, but her voice wavered. "Am I? Ask yourself why I really came here today, why I brought council members as witnesses, why I engaged in such elaborate discussion." Thomas's smile was razor sharp. "I wanted everyone to see that I was here, negotiating in good faith, while your people committed crimes against my property. When my guards catch your men breaking into my home, when they defend my property with appropriate force, no one will question it. Self-defense. Pure and simple." "You bastard," Blaine breathed. "I'm a businessman who plans ahead. You should try it sometime." Thomas mounted his horse with easy grace. "I'll give your regards to your men, if there's anything left of them to identify." He rode away, council members scrambling to follow, leaving chaos and horror in his wake. Blaine was already moving toward the barn, shouting orders. "Charlie, get horses saddled, fastest we have. Round up every man who can ride and shoot. We're going after them." "Boss, if it's a trap, then we spring it together instead of letting our men face it alone." "Move!" The ranch erupted into coordinated chaos, men running for weapons and horses, Emma barking orders about supplies and ammunition. Eliza stood frozen for a moment, watching the disaster unfold before she found her own movement. "I'm coming," she told Blaine as he prepared to mount. "Like hell you are. Those men are there because of me, because I needed evidence against Thomas. If they're in danger, I don't get to hide here while you rescue them. You don't know how to fight. I know how to shoot. David taught me when we first came west. I know how to reload, how to take cover, how to not panic under pressure." Eliza grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "I'm not a helpless victim anymore, Blaine. Stop treating me like one." For a moment, he looked like he'd argue. Then he saw something in her expression that made him nod curtly. "Stay close to me. Do exactly what I say when I say it. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" "Understood." They rode out in force, 15 men armed and grim-faced, pushing their horses hard toward Covenant Ridge and whatever trap Thomas had prepared. The sun was sinking toward the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful if they weren't riding toward potential slaughter. Charlie ranged ahead, reading trail signs and pushing the pace. Guards rode this way, moving fast, maybe 20 minutes ahead of us. Can we catch them? Not before they reach Covenant Ridge, but if we push hard, we might arrive before things get completely ugly. They pushed harder, the horses blowing steam and the landscape blurring past. Eliza clung to her mount's mane, fear and determination warring in her chest. She'd survived being cast into the snow. She'd survived Thomas's legal attacks. She'd be damned if she'd hide now while good men died for her cause. Covenant Ridge appeared as darkness fell, its lights scattered across the valley like fallen stars. The settlement looked peaceful, almost idyllic, the facade Thomas had built to hide the rot underneath. "There," Charlie pointed. 3 horses stood outside Thomas's house, 2 men visible on the porch with rifles. That's where they'd be. "No sign of our boys," Blaine said grimly. "Could mean they got away, or could mean they're inside already caught." "Or dead," someone muttered. "We go in assuming they're alive until proven otherwise," Blaine ordered. "Charlie, take 5 men and circle around back. Rest of you, with me. We approach direct. Make it clear we're here for our people and nothing else. Anyone shoots, we return fire and get our men out however we have to." They rode into Covenant Ridge as darkness settled completely, torches and lanterns creating pools of light that made the shadows deeper. People emerged from their homes, drawn by the sound of horses and armed strangers. Thomas's guards on the porch straightened, rifles coming up. "That's far enough," one of them called. "You're trespassing on private property." "We're retrieving our men," Blaine replied, not slowing his approach. 3 of them came here on business. We're taking them home. They came here to commit robbery. They've been detained pending arrival of territorial law. Show them to me. Prove they're alive and unharmed, and we'll discuss how this gets resolved. We don't negotiate with criminals. And I don't leave my men behind. Blaine's voice carried across the settlement, ensuring everyone heard. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to produce Douglas, Peterson, and the 3rd man. They're going to walk out of that house under their own power. Then we're all going to leave peacefully. Or you can refuse, and we'll come in and get them, and a lot of people will get hurt in the process. More of Thomas's men were appearing now, drawn by the confrontation. The settlement residents watched from windows and doorways, uncertain whether to run or stay, clearly unused to open conflict in their controlled little world. The front door opened. Thomas stepped out, backlit by the house's interior lights, confident as ever. "Mr. Mercer, I expected you'd come, though I thought you'd be smart enough to bring the law instead of a lynch mob. Where are my men?" "Safe, unharmed, being held in my cellar until the marshal arrives tomorrow morning." Thomas descended the porch steps. "They broke into my home, Mercer, attempted to crack my safe, steal my private property. That's not a dispute, that's a crime. And you've just ridden in here with armed men threatening violence. How do you think this looks?" "I think it looks like you baited a trap, and we walked into it. I think it looks like you've been planning this for days, waiting for an excuse to hurt my men and blame us for it. Blaine dismounted, hand resting on his pistol. And I think everyone in this settlement is watching to see what kind of man you really are. The kind who negotiates fairly, or the kind who manufactures crimes to justify violence. Murmurs rippled through the watching crowd. Thomas heard them, recalculated slightly. "I'll make you an offer," he said. "You're men for Mrs. Harper. She comes back to Covenant Ridge, faces the community she abandoned, accepts proper oversight for her clearly unstable condition. In exchange, I drop all charges against your men, and this unfortunate incident is forgotten." "Go to hell," Eliza said before Blaine could respond. She dismounted as well, walking forward until she stood level with Blaine. "I'm not going back to you, Thomas. Not for them, not for anything. You don't get to use good men as hostages to force my submission. Then those good men will face criminal charges. They'll go to prison, Mercer will lose valuable workers, and you'll still have accomplished nothing except making their sacrifice meaningless." Thomas's smile was cruel. "You're running out of options, Mrs. Harper." "So are you," Eliza replied. "Because while you've been focused on us, on setting traps and making threats, we've been gathering testimonies from everyone you've hurt. Sarah Donovan, the Hendersons, the Kowalskis, Peter Mathis's family, they're all willing to testify about what you've done. Your safe might be locked, but your secrets aren't safe anymore." It was a bluff. They had some testimonies, but not all, and nothing concrete enough yet to guarantee prosecution. But Thomas didn't know that, and Eliza could see uncertainty flicker across his face for the first time. "You're lying." "Am I? Test me. Keep our men, refuse to negotiate, force this to court. Let's see who the territory believes, the widow who nearly died in the snow or the man who profits from fear and control." The crowd was bigger now. Half the settlement gathered to watch the confrontation. Eliza could see them processing, questioning, beginning to wonder if perhaps the story they'd been told about her wasn't entirely accurate. Thomas saw it too, saw his control slipping, his narrative fracturing under scrutiny he couldn't manage. For the first time since she'd met him, Eliza saw a genuine worry in his eyes. "Release our men," Blaine said quietly. "Walk away from this while you still can, or we make this a fight you can't win." For a long moment, no one moved. The whole settlement held its breath, waiting to see which way power would fall. Then a voice called from the back of the crowd, old, female, carrying the authority of age and witnessed truth. "Let them go, Thomas. Enough." An elderly woman pushed through the watchers, leaning on a cane but moving with purpose. Eliza didn't recognize her, but Thomas clearly did. His face went pale. "Mrs. Brennan, I said enough. I've watched you rule this settlement for 5 years, watched you hurt good people and call it guidance, watched you drive out families who questioned you, watched you arrange accidents for those who wouldn't leave. I stayed quiet because I was afraid, because I thought maybe peace was worth the price." The old woman's voice shook with fury. "But this girl didn't stay quiet. This girl said no and survived and came back to fight. That takes more courage than anything we've shown. So I'm saying it now, release those men or I'll testify to everything I've seen. Every manipulation, every threat, every crime you thought no one noticed. Let's see how your reputation survives that." Other voices joined hers, tentative at first, then stronger. People Eliza didn't know, residents of Covenant Ridge who'd apparently been waiting for someone to break the silence. The dam was cracking, 5 years of suppressed truth beginning to flood out. Thomas stood frozen, watching his kingdom dissolve around him. Finally he spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Bring them up!" His guards hesitated, clearly uncertain. "Sir, I said bring them up!" Thomas's control shattered completely. "Get them out of my sight before I shoot them myself!" The guards moved, disappearing into the house. Moments later, they emerged with Douglas, Peterson, and the third man, bruised and disheveled, but alive, moving under their own power. Blaine's men surged forward to collect them, relief palpable. "This isn't over," Thomas said quietly, meant for Eliza alone. "You've won a battle, but the war continues until one of us destroys the other." "Then I guess we'll see who's left standing," Eliza replied. They mounted up and rode out, the rescued men surrounded by protective allies, the settlement erupting into chaos behind them as residents began demanding answers and accountability from the leader who'd controlled them for so long. When they were clear of Covenant Ridge, when the lights had faded behind them and the darkness provided cover, Eliza finally allowed herself to shake with reaction. They'd won. Not completely, not permanently, but enough. Blaine rode up beside her, his expression a mix of pride and concern. You did good back there. Stood your ground when it mattered most. We all did. Those people who spoke up, Mrs. Brennan and the others, they're the real heroes. They had to live under Thomas's control, and they still found courage to defy him. They found it because you showed them it was possible. That's not nothing, Eliza. She looked back toward Covenant Ridge one last time, toward the settlement where her nightmare had begun and where, tonight, it had begun to end. Thomas was still there, still dangerous, still planning his revenge. But his grip had loosened, his absolute control fractured by truth and courage and people who'd finally stopped being afraid. The war wasn't over. But for the first time since David died, Eliza believed she might actually survive it. The riders who came at dawn weren't subtle about their intentions. Eliza spotted them from the kitchen window where she'd been unable to sleep, watching the horizon lighten from black to gray to the pale gold of early morning. 20 men, maybe more, spread across the ridge overlooking the ranch like wolves studying a fold. Blaine! She called his name before conscious thought, instinct driving her voice across the quiet house. He appeared within seconds, already dressed, rifle in hand like he'd been expecting this. One look at the ridge and his jaw tightened with grim recognition. Emma, get everyone up, quietly. We don't want to spook them into attacking before we're ready. He moved to the window beside Eliza, studying the formation with military precision. That's Thomas's whole force. He's not playing games anymore. What does he want? To finish this, one way or another. Blaine touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture of reassurance or farewell. Get to the cellar. There's a tunnel that leads to the barn if things go badly. Emma knows where it is. I'm not hiding. Eliza, I'm not hiding, she repeated, harder this time. This started because I refuse to be controlled. I'm not going to end it by cowering in a cellar while good people die protecting me. Blaine looked like he wanted to argue, but Charlie appeared in the doorway with news that cut the debate short. They're sending someone down. One rider, unarmed, carrying a white flag. It's a parley, Blaine said, which means Thomas wants something before he attacks. They gathered on the porch. Blaine, Eliza, Emma, and Charlie, flanked by a dozen ranch hands who'd armed themselves with the efficiency of men who'd seen this coming. The rider approached slowly, hands visible and empty, the white cloth tied to his saddle horn snapping in the morning wind. It wasn't Thomas. It was Reverend Morrison, looking older and more tired than when Eliza had last seen him. He stopped 20 feet from the porch, close enough to talk, but far enough to run if shooting started. Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Harper, I come with a message from Mr. Gideon. We're listening, Blaine said. Mr. Gideon is prepared to offer terms. Mrs. Harper returns to Covenant Ridge voluntarily, submits to community oversight for her clearly disturbed mental state, and publicly recants her false accusations. In exchange, no charges will be filed against anyone here, the recent unpleasantness will be forgotten, and all parties can resume peaceful coexistence. Those aren't terms, Eliza said. That's surrender disguised as negotiation. Morrison's expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy. Mrs. Harper, I understand you feel wronged, but surely you can see that continued conflict serves no one. People have already been hurt, property damaged, reputations destroyed. How much more blood are you willing to spill for your pride? My pride? Eliza stepped forward, fury overriding caution. Thomas cast me out to die. He tried to destroy me legally when I survived. He's attacked this ranch, threatened good people, built an empire on fear and manipulation. And you call standing up to that pride? I call it choosing the greater good over personal vendetta. Covenant Ridge serves hundreds of families, provides order and stability in a lawless territory. One woman's grievances cannot be allowed to threaten that. Even if those grievances are true, even if Thomas is everything I say he is? Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence Eliza saw the answer written across his weathered face. He knew. Perhaps he'd always known. He simply valued order more than justice. What Mr. Gideon has built is imperfect, Morrison said finally. But it's better than chaos. Better than the alternative of no guidance, no structure, no one strong enough to make difficult decisions. Better for who? Emma demanded. Better for the families he's driven out? Better for the people who've died in convenient accidents? Better for women forced to choose between submission and exile? Better for the majority who benefit from stability he provides. The majority who are too afraid to speak up because they've seen what happens to those who do, Blaine corrected. You're not defending the greater good, Reverend. You're defending tyranny because it's familiar and tearing it down would be messy. Morrison's face hardened. I'm defending civilization against those who would tear it apart for selfish reasons. Now, will you accept the terms or not? No, Eliza said before Blaine could speak. Tell Thomas I'd rather die fighting than live on my knees. Tell him I'm not afraid of him anymore. And tell him that if he wants to attack this ranch, he'd better be prepared to explain to territorial authorities why he needed 20 armed men to terrorize a widow. You're making a mistake. Probably, but it's my mistake to make. Morrison turned his horse without another word, riding back up the ridge to where Thomas waited with his small army. Eliza watched him go, her heart pounding with fear and exhilaration in equal measure. That was either very brave or very stupid, Charlie observed. Both, Emma said, usually are the same thing in situations like this. Blaine was scanning the ridge, calculating odds and angles. They'll come at us from multiple directions, try to divide our attention. We've got good defensive positions, but not enough men to hold every approach. So what do we do? Eliza asked. We make them pay for every inch, make it costly enough that even if they win, Thomas loses more than he gains. Blaine started issuing orders, positioning men at windows and behind cover, distributing ammunition and establishing fallback points. The ranch transformed into a fortress, peaceful home becoming battlefield in minutes. Eliza found herself in the main house with Emma and 3 ranch hands positioned where they could cover the front approach. Emma showed her how to reload the rifle, where to aim, how to steady her breathing before shooting. You ever kill anyone? Emma asked casually, like they were discussing recipes. No. Probably won't have to today either. Most of Thomas's men aren't killers. They're just folks who got caught up in his system. They'll run once they realize we're serious about fighting back. Emma checked her own rifle with practiced ease. It's Thomas you need to worry about. He's got nothing to lose now. Desperate men do desperate things. The attack came an hour later, just as the sun cleared the mountains and painted everything in sharp relief. Thomas's men split into 3 groups, 1 hitting the front directly, 2 trying to flank around the barn and outbuildings. The first shots cracked across the morning, glass shattering and wood splintering as bullets found the house. Eliza fired back, aiming for the spaces between attackers rather than at them directly, just trying to keep them pinned down. The noise was overwhelming, rifles and pistols creating a continuous thunder, men shouting orders and warnings, horses screaming in panic. One of Thomas's men made it to the porch, trying to force the door. Emma shot him in the shoulder and he went down howling. Another tried the window and caught a bullet from one of the ranch hands, spinning away, clutching his leg. They're not committing, Blaine shouted from across the room. Just probing our defenses, seeing where we're weak. Then they'll find out we're not weak anywhere, Charlie called back, firing steadily from his position covering the side approach. The assault continued for 20 minutes before breaking off, Thomas's men retreating to regroup and reassess. In the sudden quiet, Eliza could hear her own heartbeat, feel the tremor in her hands from adrenaline and fear. Everyone all right? Blaine checked each position, counting heads and assessing damage. 2 men had minor wounds. The house had taken dozens of hits, but they'd held. They'll come harder next time, Emma said, reloading with efficient calm. That was just testing us. She was right. The second assault came from 2 directions simultaneously. Concentrated fire meant to overwhelm their defenses through sheer volume. Thomas's men had better cover this time, using wagons and equipment they'd dragged forward to shield their advance. Barn's on fire, someone shouted. Smoke was rising from the structure's far side, flames beginning to spread. Let it burn, Blaine ordered. We can rebuild barns, can't rebuild people. The fire forced them to abandon that defensive position, pulling men back to the house and creating a gap in their coverage. Thomas's forces exploited it immediately, pushing forward on that flank, trying to encircle them. Eliza saw one attacker break through, running low and fast toward the house's rear entrance. She swung her rifle, tracking him, squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, but close enough to make him dive for cover. Emma's follow-up didn't miss. The man went down hard, clutching his side. Nice shot, Emma said. I was aiming for his leg. Close enough. The battle raged on, each side trading fire and ground, the ranch yard becoming a chaos of smoke and blood and desperate movement. Eliza lost track of time, lost track of everything except loading and firing and trying not to die. Then suddenly the shooting stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had called halt. In the ringing silence, a voice carried across the yard. Thomas's voice, amplified by fury and desperation. "Enough! This is pointless destruction. Mrs. Harper, if you have any decency, any conscience at all, you'll end this before more people die for your stubbornness." Eliza moved to the shattered window, looking out at the smoke and destruction. Thomas stood in the open, 50 yards away, using a wagon for partial cover but making himself visible. "People are dying because of you," she shouted back, "because you can't accept that a woman said no to you, because your pride is more important than their lives. I'm offering order against chaos, structure against lawlessness. Everything I've built here serves the greater good. Everything you've built serves yourself. You don't lead, Thomas. You control. You don't guide. You manipulate. You're not civilization. You're a tyrant who happened to get here first." The watching men, both his and Blaine's, were listening now, hearing the argument laid bare without the polish of civilization to soften it. Thomas seemed to realize he was losing them, that his narrative was crumbling in real time. "You've destroyed everything." His voice cracked slightly, control slipping. 5 years of work, of building something meaningful, and you've torn it down in months because I had the audacity to offer you protection you desperately needed. I didn't need protection. I needed to be left alone. But you couldn't allow that, could you? Couldn't allow a widow to live independent, to make her own choices, to exist without your control, because that would show everyone else they could do the same. Your whole system only works when people are too afraid to say no. They need guidance. They need freedom. They need the right to question authority without being destroyed. They need to know that disagreeing with you isn't a death sentence. Eliza's voice carried across the devastated yard, reaching every listener. You talk about greater good, but the only good you've ever served is your own. Every person you've hurt, every family you've driven out, every life you've ruined, that was about maintaining your power, not protecting anyone. I gave them order. You gave them a prison and called it community. Thomas raised his pistol, pointing it directly at her. Then you've chosen death, fitting, since that's what you chose before. Blaine moved before conscious thought, throwing himself in front of Eliza as Thomas fired. The bullet caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him backward. Eliza screamed, catching him as he fell, her hands instantly slick with blood. The ranch hands erupted in fury, concentrated fire, forcing Thomas to dive behind the wagon. But he was laughing. Actual laughter carrying across the battlefield. "There it is! The truth you've been dancing around. He loves you, the great widow so devoted to her dead husband's memory. How long have you been warming his bed while playing the grieving innocent? You son of a—" Charlie's rifle cracked, splintering wood inches from Thomas's head. "Blaine," Eliza pressed her hand against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. "Stay with me. Please stay with me." "I'm all right," he managed through gritted teeth. "Shoulder wound I've had worse, but you need to finish this. One way or another, you need to finish it." Emma appeared with bandages and whiskey, working to stabilize him while Eliza stood on shaking legs. Thomas was still out there, still commanding his men, still determined to destroy everything rather than admit defeat. Something hardened in Eliza's chest, some final transformation from victim to force of nature. She grabbed a rifle, checked it was loaded, and walked toward the door. "What are you doing?" Emma demanded. "Finishing it. That's suicide. Maybe. But I'm tired of hiding behind good people while they bleed for me. This ends now." She stepped out onto the porch, fully exposed, rifle held low but ready. The shooting stopped again, everyone transfixed by the sight of the woman who'd started this walking calmly into the killing ground. "Thomas!" Her voice didn't shake. "Just you and me. Let's settle this without anyone else dying. You think I'd trust you in a fair fight? I think you're a coward who hides behind other people because you're terrified someone will finally see through your performance. All this time, all this effort, all these people hurt, and for what? Because one widow bruised your ego? How small are you, really?" Thomas emerged from cover, his face twisted with rage. "I built something. I created order from chaos. I gave people purpose and direction and safety. You created a cult of personality. You made yourself indispensable by making everyone else dependent, and now it's all falling apart because you couldn't let one woman walk away. You were supposed to die. The words burst from him like poison lanced from a wound. You were supposed to freeze in that valley and be forgotten, and everyone would learn that defying me has consequences. But you survived. You ruined everything by surviving. So kill me now. If that's what you need to restore your kingdom, take the shot. I'm right here, not running, not hiding. Prove to everyone watching that you're willing to murder an unarmed woman to maintain your power. Thomas raised his pistol with shaking hands. You think I won't? You think I have anything left to lose? I think you're about to show everyone exactly who you are, and I think that once they see it, your control is finished whether you kill me or not. For a long moment, they stood frozen. Thomas with his gun raised, Eliza standing calm and defiant, 40 witnesses holding their collective breath. Then a new voice cut through the tension, coming from the ridge where Thomas's forces had initially gathered. Put the gun down, Gideon. Marshal Crawford rode down the slope, accompanied by a dozen territorial lawmen, all of them armed and looking distinctly unhappy with what they'd witnessed. Behind them came a wagon carrying more people, Mrs. Brennan from Covenant Ridge, Sarah Donovan from Boulder Creek. Other faces Eliza didn't recognize, but who carried the weight of testimony in their expressions. What is this? Thomas demanded, the gun wavering. This is the end of your freedom, if not your life, Crawford said grimly. We've been taking statements for the past week. Seems there's a lot of people with stories to tell about Covenant Ridge and how you've been running things. Intimidation, extortion, conspiracy to commit murder. That's just the start of the charges. These are lies. Disgruntled former residents spreading slander. Maybe. Or maybe they're truth from people who finally felt safe enough to talk, Crawford gestured to his men. Either way, you're coming with us. Gun down, hands visible, or we'll assume you mean to resist arrest. Thomas looked around wildly, searching for support from his men, but they were backing away, distancing themselves, clearly wanting no part of whatever legal nightmare was descending. The careful network of control he'd built was dissolving, people choosing self-preservation over loyalty. This is her fault, Thomas pointed the gun at Eliza again. She destroyed everything. Charlie's rifle shot took him in the hand, the pistol spinning away as Thomas screamed in pain and rage. Before he could recover, Crawford's men had him surrounded and disarmed, forcing him to his knees with efficient brutality. Eliza Harper, Crawford called. You're going to need to come with us too. Give testimony, make this official. Will I be charged? For what? Defending yourself against a man who tried to kill you? Defending this ranch against an unprovoked attack? Crawford shook his head. You're a witness, Mrs. Harper. Not a criminal. There's a difference, even if Gideon spent years pretending there wasn't. The next hours blurred together. Testimony given, statements recorded, witnesses interviewed until their voices went hoarse. Mrs. Brennan spoke about the murders disguised as accidents. Sarah Donovan detailed the systematic harassment that had driven her family away. Others came forward with stories of debts manipulated, businesses sabotaged, lives destroyed for the crime of questioning authority. The territorial prosecutor arrived by afternoon, a sharp-eyed woman named Daniels, who listened to everything with the calculating attention of someone building a gallows from testimonial rope. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of legal certainty. Mr. Gideon, you're being charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, extortion, fraud, and about a dozen other crimes I'll formalize once I've reviewed all the evidence. Given the severity and the volume, I'd say you're looking at 20 years minimum if convicted, probably more. Thomas said nothing. He'd retreated into silence after his initial protests, realizing perhaps that words would only dig his grave deeper. They took him away in chains, and Eliza watched him go with emotions too complicated to name. Not triumph, exactly, not satisfaction. Just exhaustion and the faint stirring of something that might eventually become peace. Blaine had his shoulder properly bandaged by a doctor Crawford had brought, pronounced lucky that the bullet had missed bone and major vessels. He sat on the porch steps watching the legal circus, Emma beside him, and half the ranch gathered close. Well, he said when Eliza finally made her way over, that was dramatic. She laughed, the sound half hysterical with relief. That's one word for it. You walked out into active gunfire. That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen. Charlie said the same thing earlier. Seems to be a theme. Maybe because it's true. Blaine stood carefully, favoring his wounded shoulder. But it worked. You called his bluff, made him show his true nature in front of everyone. That took more courage than most people find in a lifetime. I just wanted it over. Wanted to stop hiding, stop running, stop letting fear dictate my choices. Eliza looked at the damaged ranch, at the blood and bullet holes and burn-scarred buildings. Though I'm sorry it cost you so much. Buildings can be rebuilt. Wounds heal. What we accomplished today, exposing Thomas, breaking his control, giving people back their freedom, that's worth a few bullet holes and some scorched wood. Mrs. Brennan approached, leaning on her cane but moving with renewed vigor. Mrs. Harper, I wanted to thank you for having the courage to fight when we didn't, for showing us that Thomas wasn't invincible. You're the one who spoke up in Covenant Ridge, Eliza reminded her. That took more courage than anything I did. Only because you went first. Only because you proved it was possible to survive defying him. The old woman smiled. What will you do now? With Thomas going to prison? With Covenant Ridge in chaos? With your name cleared? It was a good question. Eliza realized she'd been so focused on survival, on fighting, on simply getting through each day, that she hadn't thought about what came after victory. For the first time in months, the future stretched ahead without Thomas Gideon's shadow darkening it. I don't know, she admitted. I suppose I should figure that out. You're welcome to stay here, Blaine said quietly. Keep working. Keep building a life. The job offer wasn't contingent on fighting Thomas. I know, but maybe it's time I figured out what I want instead of just accepting what's offered. She meant it gently, but saw something flicker in Blaine's eyes, hurt, or perhaps just understanding that she needed space to discover who she was without grief or fear defining her. Over the next weeks, Covenant Ridge dissolved as a functioning community. Some families stayed, trying to rebuild something genuine from the wreckage. Others scattered, unwilling to remain in a place with such tainted memories. The territorial government appointed an interim administrator to sort through Thomas's tangled web of debts and obligations, untangling 5 years of financial manipulation. Thomas himself awaited trial in the territorial prison, his lawyers already preparing defenses that would likely fail against the mountain of testimony arrayed against him. Eliza gave her statement to Prosecutor Daniels, then deliberately put it from her mind. That chapter was closed. She refused to let it consume more of her life. At the Triple Bar M, repairs progressed steadily. The barn was rebuilt, stronger than before. Bullet holes were patched, windows replaced, blood scrubbed from wood and stone until only memory marked where violence had occurred. The ranch hands worked with renewed purpose, proud of what they'd defended and determined to restore it. Eliza continued cooking, but found herself restless in ways she hadn't expected. The work was honest and the people kind, but it felt temporary somehow, like she was waiting for permission to want more than just survival. It was Emma who finally said what everyone was thinking. They were working together in the kitchen, preparing dinner for the crew, when Emma set down her knife and looked at Eliza directly. He's in love with you. You know that, right? Eliza's hand stilled in the bread dough. Emma, don't play coy. Blaine's been in love with you since the day he pulled you from that snow. Maybe before. Maybe from the moment he heard about a widow who chose death over submission. Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, without judgment. Question is, what are you going to do about it? I don't know. David's only been gone 2 years. It feels wrong to even think about. David's dead, honey. And he'd want you to live, not spend the rest of your life in mourning. Emma resumed chopping vegetables with efficient precision. I'm not saying you need to marry Blaine tomorrow. I'm saying you need to be honest about what you feel and what you want. Life's too short, and this territory's too hard to waste time on noble suffering. That night, Eliza found Blaine in the barn, checking on a mare that was close to foaling. He looked up when she entered, surprise and wariness crossing his face. Everything all right? Emma says you're in love with me. Blaine went very still. Emma talks too much. Is she right? For a long moment he said nothing, just stood there in the lamplight, looking at her with an expression that held everything he'd been too careful to say. Finally, he nodded. Yeah, she's right. Has been for months now, maybe longer. He laughed without humor. Not exactly ideal timing, falling for a woman fighting for her life. But there it is. Why didn't you say anything? Because you just lost your husband. Because you were traumatized and terrified and needed safety, not romantic pressure. Because I didn't want you feeling obligated to return feelings out of gratitude. Blaine leaned against the stall door, suddenly looking exhausted. And because I was afraid that if I told you, you'd leave. That you'd feel uncomfortable staying here, working here, being around me. I couldn't risk that. Eliza moved closer, drawn by honesty she hadn't expected. What if I told you I'm not sure what I feel? That David's death is still too close, still too raw, but that when you took that bullet for me, something shifted in my chest? I'd say that's fair. I'd say you need time to grieve and heal and figure out who you are without tragedy defining you. Blaine met her eyes steadily. I'd say I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. And if eventually you decide you don't feel the same way, I'd accept that too and just be grateful you're alive and safe. That's a lot of patience. You're worth a lot of patience. They stood in silence, the mare shifting in her stall, the night settling around them with the weight of unspoken possibilities. Finally, Eliza spoke. I need to leave. Not forever. Maybe not even for long. But I need to go somewhere that's just mine, figure out what I want without anyone else's expectations shaping it. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. Blaine's voice was steady despite the pain visible in his eyes. Where will you go? Denver, maybe. Or back east to visit my father. Somewhere I can think clearly, can process everything that's happened without battlefields and courts and constant crisis. She touched his hand briefly, a gesture of connection without commitment. But I'd like to come back, eventually, if the offer's still open. It'll always be open. You'll always have a place here, Eliza, whatever form that takes. She left 2 weeks later, riding out on a spring morning when the mountains were brilliant with new snow and the air tasted like possibility. The ranch hands lined up to say goodbye. Emma hugged her hard enough to crack ribs, and Blaine stood on the porch watching with an expression that held hope and heartbreak in equal measure. Don't be a stranger, he called as she rode away. I won't be, she promised, and meant it. Denver was overwhelming after months of frontier isolation. So many people, so much noise, civilization pressing in from all sides. But it was also liberating, being anonymous in a crowd, being just another woman instead of the widow who'd defied Thomas Gideon. She found work at a newspaper, setting type like she'd done in her father's shop, her education and experience valuable in a city hungry for skilled labor. She wrote to Blaine weekly, letters that chronicled her days and thoughts and slow healing. He wrote back just as regularly, news of the ranch and the territory and the trial that had finally convicted Thomas on 17 counts, sentencing him to 30 years in territorial prison. 6 months passed, then a year. Eliza built a life in Denver, comfortable, independent, entirely her own. She made friends, earned respect, proved she could stand alone without man or marriage defining her. It was everything she'd fought for, everything she'd needed. And yet, she found herself thinking about the Triple Bar M more and more, about Emma's fierce loyalty and Charlie's dry humor, about the ranch hands who'd fought for her without question, about Blaine standing in the barn, offering patience without condition. One evening in early autumn, she made a decision. She gave notice at the newspaper, packed her belongings, and booked passage on the next stage heading west. The ranch looked exactly the same and completely different. The buildings had been repaired, paint fresh, and fences straight. But there was something else. A new barn, bigger than the old one. An addition on the main house. Signs of prosperity and growth. Blaine was working in the corral when she arrived, breaking a young horse with the patient competence she remembered. He looked up at the sound of hoofbeats and went completely still, like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Eliza? She dismounted, suddenly nervous. Hi, I hope the offer's still open. I know it's been a year and you might have moved on. Might have... He crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of every day of waiting. The offer's open. It'll always be open. But what changed? Why come back now? Because I figured out what I want. And it's not just safety or gratitude or needing someone to fight my battles. She pulled back enough to look at him directly. It's partnership. It's building something together. It's choosing you because I want to, not because I need to. That's what took me so long to understand, the difference between those things. And you're sure. Because I meant what I said about waiting. If you need more time, I'm sure. She kissed him, soft and certain. I've had my time. I've built my independence. I've proven I can stand alone. Now I want to choose to stand beside you. They married in the spring, a small ceremony attended by the ranch hands and Emma and a surprising number of former Covenant Ridge residents who'd rebuilt their lives and wanted to celebrate with the woman who'd given them freedom. Mrs. Brennan came, using her cane to dance at the reception with a joy that defied her years. Sarah Donovan brought her daughter, healthy and happy and unburdened by fear. Even Marshall Crawford appeared, gruff but pleased that justice had prevailed. The years that followed were hard in the way frontier life was always hard. Drought seasons and bitter winters, cattle prices that fluctuated, challenges that required both partnership and individual strength to overcome. But Eliza and Blaine faced them together, building the Triple Bar M into something more than just a ranch. It became a refuge, a place where people escaping abuse or control could find safety and new starts. They hired women who needed work and men who needed purpose, creating a community based on mutual respect instead of hierarchy. Emma trained the next generation of cooks and housekeepers, passing on skills and the fierce independence that had sustained her. Charlie became foreman, still dry-humored and competent, still the one you wanted beside you when trouble arrived. The ranch prospered not despite its principles but because of them, proving that decent treatment and fair wages built loyalty that couldn't be bought with fear. Eliza never forgot the valley where Blaine had found her, never forgot the moment she'd chosen death over submission, but she also never let it define her. She was a rancher's wife, a business partner, a voice in territorial politics arguing for laws that protected the vulnerable. She was a writer contributing articles to Denver newspapers about frontier life and women's experiences. She was herself, complex and strong, and still learning who that meant. Thomas Gideon died in prison 7 years later, reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. Covenant Ridge was absorbed into the growing territory, its separate identity dissolving as new settlers arrived who'd never heard of its corrupt founder. Some of the original residents stayed and built something better. Others scattered to the winds, carrying lessons learned into new communities. On the 10th anniversary of the day, Blaine found her in the snow. Eliza stood on the porch of the ranch house watching the sun set over mountains that no longer felt like barriers, but like home. Blaine appeared beside her, sliding an arm around her waist with the easy affection of long partnership. "Thinking about what might have been?" he asked. "Thinking about what is, what we built from nothing but stubbornness and hope. And a little bit of luck, if I hadn't been riding through that valley that day. But you were, and I survived, and we fought, and we won, and we built this." She gestured to the ranch, to the lights in the bunkhouse, to the life they'd created. "That's not luck, Blaine. That's choice. Mine, yours, everyone who decided to stand up instead of submit. Still, I'm grateful. So am I." She turned to kiss him, soft and certain. For the rescue, for the partnership, for believing I was worth fighting for when I'd almost forgotten it myself. They stood together as darkness fell and stars emerged, two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and built something beautiful from the wreckage. The territory was changing, growing, becoming the kind of place where law meant more than whoever had the most guns, and justice was more than whatever the powerful decided it should be. Eliza had helped make that change, one refusal at a time, one stand at a time, one day of choosing courage over comfort. She'd survived being left to die, survived the man who'd tried to erase her, survived grief and fear and the slow work of rebuilding herself. And more than survived, she'd thrived, had become the woman David had believed she could be, and Blaine had recognized she already was, had proven that sometimes the most powerful thing you could say was a simple, devastating no. The ranch settled into evening quiet, smoke rising from chimneys, horses nickering in corrals, the peaceful sounds of home and safety and hard-won freedom. Somewhere in the darkness, the valley where she'd nearly died lay empty and indifferent, its snow covering all tracks like the past had never existed. But Eliza remembered, would always remember, not with bitterness or trauma, but with the hard-edged pride of someone who'd faced the worst and refused to break. She'd been left to freeze as punishment for defiance. Instead, she'd become fire itself, burning away the rot, warming the worthy, proving that some women were too fierce to extinguish. And in the end, That made all the difference.